Hi, I'm Japanese Gary Ben. This is my video diary of my progress of learning Japanese with the AJATT method. This video has a few goals. One of them is to keep a diary so that I can show my progress to people. Another one is so that using my own mouth I can explain in a single record briefly how AJATT works and get out my complaints about more traditional ways of learning languages and comparing what really matters about the difference between them. So I can always point to this video if those people want to know my specific opinion. Also, allow people to know me, get my face out there in places where people have interacted with me, but now they can better humanize me, and after that, to explain things I did wrong so that you can do way better. I would have made diary entries before, but I have a history of quitting things and didn't want to make such an embarrassment public, as you can imagine. So you can view this as part of my over a year celebration, with 18 months usually being the main sort of AJATT goal, but realistically it will extend further than that as you continue studying. Anyone doing AJATT already won't really need the first section of this video, because I talk about things you already know, or things you probably already feel, so unless you want to slack off hearing a man preaching to the choir, I will add timestamps in a description box. People can easily access the sections of the video they feel is most relevant to them. Disclaimer of 3 things. Please excuse that I will most likely be unable to edit this video, so there'll be a few pauses as I try to think, and I'd likely spend a decent amount of time staring directly at my notes, which you've probably also already figured out the angle between that and my camera, and also a bit to the left as I look to my screen, which displays what I'm currently doing. 2, the video is likely to be pretty long, depending on how I stammer through things. And 3rd, is it's probably not a way to record this without reflecting in my glasses, and I'd like to apologise for that. And a warning of, I'll most likely swear, but not really in an angry way, just in a passionate way. So I would like people to acknowledge that this video might not be suitable for children, for any stranger that's going to watch this. So first of all, I'd like to cover an outline of AJATT itself. AJATT itself is basically a blog about this guy called Katsumoto, that's his nickname, who mostly in the 3rd year of university, it seems, became, basically fluent in Japanese just by immersing in watching things all the time, reading things all the time, and basically how to replicate the sort of thing he did. Some of the ideas, well, it's basically something he put together after looking up a lot of ideas about how language is attained, etc., etc. There are some similar blogs that would be quite useful even if you're looking towards AJATT, like Anti-Moon, which is about learning English in the same sort of method, and the thing that speaks for it is that it's written in immaculate English. Also Stephen Krashen, which I'll bring up more later as he becomes more relevant. And of course this comes with complete admittance that because of that some of these ideas aren't new, which some people seem to take as a negative thing. And also that Katz has done things that have caused a negative background, even when they're things as simple and zany as going as far as eating cake with chopsticks just to try and get in more of the Japanesey mood. And it's not perfect, is another thing I'd like to mention. Most people learning AJATT are probably doing it primarily through a YouTuber called Matt vs. Japan, who might as well be the front of modern AJATT at this point, seeing that he has done it for a long enough point and often provides many useful tools to people and insights about how it works, and indeed some criticisms of 1.0 AJATT itself. The few things he pretty much adds for his own method, which up till recently he just referred to as AJATT. I'm actually caught in a bit of a pickle in that I'm still going to refer what I'm doing as AJATT, but I will be basically doing what Matt says, so you might as well call it what he calls it, which is now Mass Immersion Approach, which is a far more broader title for understanding exactly what you're going to do. But you don't need to really worry about many differences. You would just need to look at AJATT and then look at Matt's videos, and you would most likely get the gist of it. The main problem, in his opinion, being basically the idea that AJATT will get you the whole way, and it will get you to basic fluency, but it won't get you to native level. So mostly it's like that it goes to about 90%, and the extra 10% is a bit more work. It mostly doesn't cover things like pitch accent, which is pretty important to Japanese, that cats didn't seem to really acquire at all, because an adult it seems to require conscious effort rather than just listening. So after you get to a certain point, you will need to consciously learn pitch accent. And there's a few ideas that are a bit shortcuts to things that are criticised, and I will go over those, so you don't need to even worry too much. But I will put these things in the description. If you are interested in knowing more in your study of Japanese or indeed any language, I implore you to read the AJATT table of contents, except things probably marked new because they aren't necessary, which is the mess of AJATT in its golden collection of why and how in 1.0 AJATT, and then make a move to Matt vs. Japan's YouTube channel. And these things will be linked in the description, so you don't need to worry about them. As for a rough overview of what AJATT entails, it's basically, the idea is learning from immersion. People consider this sort of magic, so I will explain the main points, main beliefs that kind of run AJATT, and then as I go through this video talking about the kind of beliefs people have, I will then explain in more solid words what for each section AJATT entails. So I think a really core part of AJATT is input before output. Input being when you have interaction with your immersion environment, you know, reading things, listening to things, etc., etc., and output being things like reading or writing. And this is obvious, but the extent that AJATT takes it is not speaking before fluency, because there really isn't any point. Speaking is entirely a product of understanding. Speaking before it becomes natural is kind of admitting you're just forcing words out of your head rather than really feeling them. Another thing is pretty much it's getting as much listening as possible, of course. A lot of other methods don't sort of do this, but naturally if you want to do immersion, get as much listening as possible. So pretty much constant listening if you can during free time, and in other cases getting passive listening by getting it in when like making a meal, going to the toilet, or in work where possible, because you want to get as much immersion as you can. This is why probably the best identifier of all AJATTers is that they will have a headphone in at all times. I am actually currently listening to a certain magical index. And the standards for what you should be listening or consuming at all is Japanese for Japanese people. You're not allowed to use learning materials aimed at foreigners because they will be dumbed down and ultimately not real. Japanese spoken, what you want is Japanese spoken at normal speed, the way Japanese people actually say it. The closest most people seem to get is like CDs on textbooks that say single words, and for one, that's way too much of an announcer voice, and two, for Japanese, single words will not get you a good sounding sentence. Words can be heavily affected by the flow of the sentence, and indeed like where a word is in it, etc. But the main mechanisms for how you properly do this, other than what you probably think is just magic, is proper use of an SRS, which is what pretty much anyone who learns language already does. I'll explain the way people do it for AJATT later. But if you don't know what an SRS is, it's a spaced repetition system. It's an electronic flashcard system where you make your own flashcards. You can edit them quite freely. There's a lot of options to make them suitable for whatever you're doing. But it's pretty famous for learning languages. But naturally it works by an algorithm where you basically just have to show up each day and check your cards for whatever is apparently useful that day. It has naturally have spaces between it based on how well you're doing. So it naturally tries to work on when you're actually forgetting things to remind you what they are. But I will cover anything more specific to that later. I think you would get the idea. And the last thing is probably quite radical to a lot of people. Is learning kanji all at the beginning through something called James Heisig's Remembering the Kanji, which is a system of remembering the kanji by writing them out and putting stories to the separate radicals. People have done other things probably quite close to this, but there's a few reasons why RTK is probably the best. And to put a civil point to it before I get to it later is that, one, you're learning more at the beginning, you're not bringing any other drag into the language, you're not holding yourself back by saying you need tons of vocabulary, and it easily removes the headache straight away. So, as I go forward, I would like to, as I go into further things, you probably already think this is quite a bit of a tangent from what most people are used to in languages, so I'd like to tackle some pre-existing beliefs about languages to try and get people to better understand. This section onwards in the video, things may sound a bit strawman-y in how low my expectations for traditional learning is, but it's important exactly because those people exist and influence people and are surprisingly common, and it's important for beginners to not become those people, because beginners are in better shape to not make these mistakes, because people who have been doing these sorts of things naturally build up an attachment to what they've been doing, so even at that point, if they put in so many years into something, it would just become hard to accept the problems with it. And so I'd first like to implore you to think to yourself what you think gets you to fluency. I think you'd find that people actually don't have much of an idea. It just gets a bit full in the background and too much of a future thing to end up thinking about. Like asking, do you have an idea, or are you just learning based on what seems obvious? Naturally, crushingly, in a way that is also annoying to me. If you want to get into any language, anyone, no matter who they are, no matter what actual ability they've ever had in a language themselves, will tell you to take a class. But that sounds like it makes sense for beginners, because that's what everyone does. But will anyone come out of class fluent? Does anyone believe that? Of course they don't. So what ultimately do you need to do to become fluent? A lot of people like to think that you need to go to the country. Being in the country really put you over the edge. But there are ultimately reasons why people don't get good at a language from being in the country. This sort of thing is covered on at least one article in AJATT pretty well, but I will go over the basics of it here. If you go into a country, chances are you will be forced to speak that language pretty early stage, making mistakes with an incomplete model of language and sort of solidifying it just out of habit. And this gets really hard to fix later, even when people who have been in the country for ages and totally understand everything they hear still can't speak properly because they've just built their own habits of not needing to pay attention to certain information, speaking in certain ways, and even to a level of knowing that something is totally grammatically incorrect, but they can't stop themselves from saying it anymore because that's how they think for that language. So getting language right ultimately means making your pattern conform as much to reality as possible. Anything less than that and you're just outputting your own set of assumptions. So you're just going to solidify that and cause problems. The other sort of way this goes is try to avoid that, and you ultimately end up living in that country in a bubble of your own language where you don't actually need to interact with that country's language, so you never really learn it. This could be visibly seen like in any foreigners going to any place. They build up their own community, and then tons of them aren't able to interact with people outside that community until they have children, etc., etc. So ultimately, it's easy to learn language when not in the country at all, because you don't have the pressure of how to speak it right away, which is going to screw you up, and you don't have the pressure of not having to speak it right away, and therefore going into a bubble where you're not really doing anything with it. So ultimately what AJATT does is just focus on making the environment you're currently in into your own immersion bubble of that language by making as many things as possible entirely that language. But any people's faith in immersion seems, well, it's usually kind of a really vague thing that usually involves the previous examples I mentioned. So it can get a bit weird after trying to explain it to them after that. Otherwise, immersion is often treated as like a cool tip for language, like to get slightly better. Like, I've seen plenty of videos where people go like, having anime on the background while I studied felt like it helped my pronunciation for my exams. I'm like, of course it did. I mean, having on the background's a bit shoddy, but you know, you're not going to be able to speak a language if you don't know what it sounds like. And of course, getting a bit of listening in will certainly help that a bit. But the ultimate reality I'm trying to get at here is you won't get fluency without immersion. That's the core point. Decent plans of learning a language usually acknowledge immersion as like a final step, but without really any way of tackling it. A lot of people just like do this textbook, then do these vocab things, then immersion, and then they don't say anything. So I don't really know what people's methods for immersion really are. I don't think anyone really knows. I think at best it comes people just go like see a word and then look it up and then make a card. AJATT does a thing different to that, and I'll explain why that's a bit more advantageous. But the advantage here is, of course, that AJATT gives a simple as possible method with like barely anything dragging behind it, just a simple mechanism for learning the language directly through making the most out of any immersion you get, and doing it from the very start, doing pretty much whatever you want to be doing. Because after all, probably everything you like doing exists in that language. And yet a lot of people are ultimately just afraid of touching the language, even when they are learners. I remember when I was starting AJATT a year ago, just before June, when I was changing everything I did into the Japanese language setting, and I was just having a game of Overwatch. It's like, it's not even against Japanese people, because I'm still on the same server, but like, all my stuff was in Japanese, and I was in a duel, and some guy got really upset, and I thought it was funny to take like his raging reactions. So I took screenshots of it, put it on Twitter, and one of my Japanese language learning acquaintances, which I assume have been learning Japanese longer than I had at that point, came in like, whoa, calm down, not everything needs to be in the language. I mean, can you even read all that? It's like, it's a few menu prompts, and people already get that scared. I mean, luckily it wasn't the main menu, because that's just kana, and that would be embarrassing to kind of worry about. But the main thing is, like, if I did understand it, it probably wouldn't be much use to me. It would be practice, which is decent. Seeing the same things more times is decent, but I don't need to force it, really. So, like, I want to find things I don't understand so I can understand them. And alongside that sort of thing, a lot of people have the idea of, like, I'm learning a language to, like, I'll read manga and watch anime without subs after getting fluent. Like, the stages for getting to fluency would be, I'll do tons of textbooks, such as vocab lists, or like anything that like is vague that they probably haven't thought about. And then after I've done that, I will finally do that thing. Whereas for AJATT, you just do it. And that's probably more fun. And you can learn directly from it. Like, no amount of vocab lists will get you there. No amount of vocab lists is going to allow you to just read Naruto. You're still going to have to put up with a lot of ninja bullshit. And a lot of people have this idea of, like, they hate kanji because it's just a hurdle to them that they feel takes forever because they have no real way of just getting past it, other than, say, like, learning a bunch of vocabulary with that kanji, and that's just awkward for naturally holding those words in your vocabulary. But I think they would like it if only they knew it, though. I mean, this is a weird thing to say, because, like, well, if I knew it, of course I'd like it. But I speak from experience of here. It's like, even if you just do RTK, you'd be like, well, I rarely see any symbols that I don't technically know, so it's a lot of load off my back. But a lot of people end up doing things like, man, I really wish Japanese people would just do Romaji, blah, blah, blah. And I'll cover more complaints about that when I go specifically into the RTK section. But I'd like to go further in the point about no talking or writing until fluency, and why people do this. The main point is, why would you speak when you can't understand? A core belief you need to take on is that speaking comes directly from understanding input. If you understand input properly, and it's just melted into your mind, speaking will become natural. You don't have to force it out of you. There's no need to speak things when you can't understand, because there's a great example on AJATT for, like, if you ask directions. Like, you learn all the words to ask directions, but if you don't understand the words coming back, then it's pointless. a lot of people, it's a bit of a hard point that I'd like to say to a lot of people, but if a teacher says to you, or like a Japanese person just says to you like, good job, it doesn't mean you've done it right. It just means you've maybe improved, or you're heading towards the right direction. Like, there's no way you're going to get it right the first time, and there's certainly no way you're going to get it right by not listening to something a decent number of times. An example for you is that a lot of Japanese people have far more of a motivation to learn English, and they're of course people who are very, very good at it. And so they're so good that I wouldn't like question some of the Japanese, like question becoming friends with just some of the Japanese English speakers on YouTube, because they're that good. They seem easy to talk to. They still can't hear the difference between light and right, though. If you imagine that sort of problem just projected on tons of words on the language all the time, then you kind of understand the wall that English speakers learning Japanese really have. Another false sort of flag is that a lot of people treat speaking fast like it's a goal, when it has nothing to do with understanding or actually correct execution of the words. Because after all, if they don't understand what the language really sounds like, all they're really doing is saying the image of those sounds in their head in a fast enough speed that they think, makes sense. And so I've seen a few examples of people who just get bewildered and just pissed that they speak to some Japanese people at a decent speed, and the Japanese person just wants to respond to them in an attempt at English to try and communicate, because they assume the Japanese person is thinking this person can't speak Japanese. It's probably because you can't. I mean, you're not really doing it. You just learn some words and you're trying to sound them out at speed in a sentence that you created. It doesn't really mean you're speaking Japanese. And also there's probably a massive mountain between you and a Japanese person in terms of pronunciation, which is made bigger by the fact that Japanese people most likely have never really heard anything other than Japanese people and people who learned a bit of Japanese. And it's a massive difference. One of the bigger problems with that is, of course, pitch accent, as mentioned. You can't expect yourself to identify pitch accent if you're already having trouble just understanding speech at native speed. Being corrected is only helpful if you also understand the correction. Lots of people love talking about corrections. There's a weird reply on one of the articles on AJATT itself where someone said, actually I disagree about not talking. I found talking is totally helpful. Like, people correct me all the time. But the thing is, you probably only think that because correcting is the best way you know, rather than actually a good way. Being corrected forces you to output just to find out, and that means you have to be wrong in order to be corrected. You're teaching yourself to output wrong things so that you might get the right thing back, and then maybe learn that from it being said to you. Sometimes the answer is as simple as, it's not said like that, and I think people who do something like Lang 8 will understand that after a while. After making diary entries, you'll eventually just get the feeling of, it's not said like that, and the reality is that a lot of the language is just going to be like that. It's going to be a matter of, that's not natural, that's not what people actually say, and you'll have no impression of this unless you've actually learned the language from immersion. And this kind of example that isn't perfect, that I've thought is a metaphor, really, is that people just say this all the time. It's like, well, how are you going to get good at language if you don't speak it? Well, if I'm not good at it, then I'm not going to be able to speak it anyway. But I imagine it's like somebody with a water gun, and after filling the water gun up with like a shot glass of water every time, are convinced they need to start firing it. And so they're actually going like, why isn't this working? I'm filling it with a bit of water and then firing it, and it's not getting any more full. That's what it's like, in my opinion. Like, people can't understand that shooting water out of a gun that isn't full isn't going to get it fuller. A point I'd like to go into classrooms is, people in classrooms aren't taught using the best way to learn. They're taught using the most convenient way to teach. If they can't turn it into a grade, it's probably useless to them. The reality is the best speakers of any language have never taught it. and yet they never need to tell someone their grade because they reach such a level that their ability need not be evaluated. If someone asked me now, like, if a native speaker or a foreigner who learned the language themselves is actually better, assuming the foreigner is actually fluent, not just has high grades, like, for example, tons of Japanese people who teach English at a high grade and just haven't touched the language really for ages, and yet teach English to other Japanese people. Like, I'd be pretty split on what I actually think is good, because a native speaker will have no idea about the process of learning the language, and the person who learned the language might not ever have reached actual native level. The best situation is actually to not rely on a teacher at all. There aren't really any advantages, in my opinion, and certainly a group environment more so. If self-study immersion, in self-study immersion, you're going to pick exactly what is meant for you at your level by your own judgment, whereas a teacher has to guess this and will probably always deliver it to you in an unnaturally organised package designed to make classwork the most efficient. And so people are confident that they can talk okay, etc., but they can't watch TV or read, and this is an entire fallacy. Like, have you ever heard of a professional builder that has never witnessed the thing he's building, but has been practicing it for years and is convinced he's pretty good at it? Why would you even say you talk if you can't listen? The reality is that outputting is devoid of any conscious knowledge of where the real ceiling or challenge of the language is outside of conscious feedback by an authority. In reality, language in the wild, you can feel how good you really are. Other people are restricted by, like, textbooks. It really is the Plato's cave of language learning. Because being an AJATT, even past fluency, is probably just this awkward area above most learners of Japanese, whilst constantly being aware you can't even touch a native's ability yet. Because you're outside of the learner's bubble, so you can just see Japanese world for how it is. So that's what you have to deal with. And so all the time you're reminded that I still can't deal with all of it yet. And even when someone gets to a stage of dealing with all of it, they still won't be able to necessarily deal with all of it at a native level, at a level of producing it natives. But people who don't do immersion will never even touch this, which is why it's so easy to feel like, even though they're just like, oh no, book's too hard, kanji. Listening, it's just too fast. Oh, but I can speak though. I mean, what is that? That means nothing. Like, meanwhile, people will argue on the internet about how they're almost entirely in the realm of textbooks or standardized testing and treat methods outside of that with a weird level of suspicion or mysticism. Maybe because people don't often make, like, succinct methods for it, so they think it's just weird. But I'll tell you right now, I'm the exact type of person that can't work without a good method, and literally I really didn't need to do anything other than apply this method and just do it. So you can feel quite, like, rest assured that at least there is a method here, and so you don't have to, like, just do a bunch of guesswork. But people do treat languages still with a mysticism, or people get good with a mysticism because they can't really understand the mechanisms they've been doing. There's an example recently where I remember a post that someone put on. It was a link to a forum post. Someone put it on Matt vs Japan's Discord, where someone linked to a forum about a guy posted who got really good at Chinese, and the tendency of comments was to ignore how he spent the first 4 years just doing things in the language, and started theorizing how knowing to play an instrument must have really helped his ability to process pitch. Like, doing anything to avoid actually acknowledging that the person did a lot of work in the language, and literally talking about how being a musician will help you be better at language. Like, they'd rather rely on that sort of mysticism. If you really want to know how good someone is, you need to ask them, like, how much they understand, not really how much they can talk. People's ability, especially in outputting, is only really measurable by someone who's better than them. So if someone speaks, you need to ask, like, a native's opinion on their speech. And because there is such a massive chasm between these two sort of areas, and because I say right now that AJATT, like, putting a decent amount of time in it, getting to, like, low-level fluency is, like, 18 months, usually, if you want to go by the amazing CATS model. Even things like like kanji, because you don't learn with RTK, you don't learn words with it, you just learn the symbols. There can be an illusion of progress where people who do a traditional language learning experience seem like they're going way ahead, but they're really not, because they'll get like vocabulary of those kanji, but then once they get further than that, they'll just stop, because they'll be stopped having things provided to them. And the main reason why learning through immersion is quite different from that, where you can just run ahead because things can just go like, and here's what this word means, and here's what this word means if you apply it to specific English. The main point that I want to get across here is that knowledge and ability are different things. Traditional methods of studying Japanese. AJATT means experiencing it. A core part of learning language naturally is just getting used to how it's used, which feels both more solid and less awkward than just being told to remember rules and having to fiddle with them. And there's a lot of... when you tell people this sort of thing, a lot of people are like, well, I like my method more. That seems too hard. Like, too much commitment, too much time, to mostly just put all your time in Japanese. But I'm going to drive this point harder later, is that real life has no grades. If you don't put the work in, a native isn't just going to agree that you're good at their language. You really can't just say, I'm not really willing to do that work, but I think my method is fine, if your method's not actually getting you anywhere. And, like, people may excuse that by saying, but I don't want to get good, I just want to read manga and watch anime. Or, like, this is just a hobby for me, etc, etc. Like, even then, AJATT is still faster. Outside of maybe some guy who makes terrible, like, vocabulary SRS decks for every show you feel like watching. Like, there's no way you're just going to learn those words. Because there just won't be in a textbook. And so you'd have to rely on some lists some guys making somewhere and hope they're right, trust them for no reason. And AJATT just ends up being faster because you're just dealing with language how it is. Once the information stops, for other people they can't proceed anymore because there isn't anyone guiding them. And honestly, after that I have to say that it's a decent point in AJATT that you really have to buckle down with, is this an investment in a skill. Being good at something means sucking at other things. You always have to make sacrifices if you want to be good at least one thing. A lot of people like to say, like, AJATT is too strict, but ultimately it's that actually becoming near native level from adult studying of a foreign language is not for everyone. It's not that just people won't get to it, it's that probably with the right method, probably anyone could get to it, but they probably aren't willing to. It just requires way too much time and too much sacrifice of other time. But next, now I've ended that, is proper use of an SRS. The reason why you want to use an SRS, and the reason why you learn, well, probably the way you use it is for AJATT is quite simply, you go and read things or watch things and listen to something. When you find a sentence that stands out, you take it. And what you do is you take that sentence, you put it on the front side of the card, and on the back side of the card you put the definition of the one word you don't know in it. The reason why you do this, well, there's a few. The first one is, this has direct meaning. This tells you exactly how that word is used and relates into how it really works. Traditional methods are just a matching game where you just put a Japanese word on the front, an English word on the back, or the other way around. It's really experience in testing that knowledge of real sources that makes you learn, not that you have a flashcard with an English word on the back. The reason why it's specifically what you have to focus on is one part of a sentence that you don't know. It has to be a sentence where you understand all but one thing. And this is specifically I+1 learning acquisition, which comes from Stephen Krashen, which why you should really get a basic idea of what that is. If you Google him and for the words comprehensible input, you'll most likely easily find a talk by him, and it's not very complicated. It's usually just a small interview. It's the same clip that everyone really uses. The example of usage, of course, the reason why you have a sentence is if you don't have this, you know nothing about the word is used. If you don't have an example, you can't know more than one reading or definition of a word, which is kind of, it's a bit of a random sidestep, but it's why Wanikani sucks. Matt has a video on it, and it's specifically why RTK is the best way to learn kanji, but I haven't watched it because honestly at this point I didn't need it, and I was too far into studying that I didn't really need preaching to the choir about methods I'd already given up. But I'm someone who's done Wanikani. And like, for Wanikani, of course, what you have on the front is, when you're studying a vocabulary, what you have is a word on the front, and either the test is the reading for it or the definition of it. And I would like to hopefully raise at least people who know some basic Japanese problems with that by writing a single word that's actually really common. I've a clipboard right here, so you can know it. Right, see this word? It's drawn terribly, I totally admit it. You probably know this word if you've studied a bit of Japanese. Can you tell what its reading is? Chances are you can't, because I'm going to be an arsehole and say that whatever reading you say, it's the other one. And that's exactly the problem. How do you test for something that has multiple readings from how it's spelt? You need context, you need a sentence that differentiates it from the other thing, otherwise you're not going to really do it. Another big problem with this is that this applies with definitions too. Learning a single word and saying that's the only time you're going to need to learn that word is a real big problem, because there are indeed words with many meanings, and if you just make a deck for it where you have an English meaning on the back, either you're going to have to make multiple cards where the front of it is that word and the back of it is the English definition, where you can't tell which one of those like 3 or 4 definitions might be coming up, and just guess which one it is. So if you have a sentence on the front, at least you can differentiate it. At least you can understand it from that point. Another example I would like to make specifically for that, it's probably drawing this quite unattractively, but you'll understand what it is. Again, this only applies to, fortunately, people who have learned the word. You see this word? You probably know it, it's very common. It also has quite a few definitions, but if you learn it in Wanikani, of course, because there's only one card for this word, what you have is like some synonyms and some words that are definitely different as possible answers you can give. And it just doesn't work, precisely because this word has like 4 definitions, all of which are pretty damn useful, and all of which are pretty much in exclusively different types of sentences that you would better understand if you had seen them in that sentence, instead of learning from Wanikani and then going backwards, and then guessing and then learning the pattern afterwards. And also, this is terrible for learning, because it can convince you that you actually ultimately know everything this word does, but Wanikani only tests you that you can put in one of the possible answers. And that may be okay if you're talking synonyms of English words that describe how it's used, if you're going to go for that. But this possible correct answer section includes other uses of this word. So even when you've convinced yourself that you've learnt this word, you probably only need to remember one definition of it for Wanikani to tell you that you're correct. And so that's why you need to make a sentence for different definitions of a word. Well, not make a sentence, get a sentence for different definitions of a word that demonstrate it used differently, so you can have a clear idea of what that means, and also so even when as simple as a vocabulary list flashcard, you can turn it over and not have to guess which one of the definitions you're testing yourself at one time. Another thing is Wanikani's definition, like example sentences. You might bring that up. They really aren't good enough. One, because you're not actually tested on the example sentences, and there's like 2 of them for each thing, and one of them is easy, one of them is hard. But most likely, Wanikani is going to be your source for learning vocabulary anyway. So chances are you won't just won't have enough vocabulary to understand that sentence, because you just aren't far enough. And a big problem with this is after you've learnt that, and learn words a bit vaguely, is that you're deliberately applying them backwards when you go read actual Japanese. You'll be forcing your understanding of English onto the Japanese word instead of making the effort to understand the Japanese word itself. For example, there's a word in Japanese that like could basically always be translated in English as to take. And while this applies to a lot of sentences, I think the very vague usages of take involved in it just get really awkward. Like one of them is to take off clothing. That would be better described as take off. But if people just only learn the word as take, then convince themselves they just know every definition, even though it includes take off clothing, earn points, steal, etc., etc. When ultimately, if you look up in the dictionary itself, depending on the pedantism of the dictionary, you might get up to like 40 definitions for specific sort of areas in which it's used in, which may not ever get up to that many, but like there'll be at least 4 or 5 that you will have to learn decently. And so just going, oh, I learned take, and I see that word take, like, yeah, I can see it being worked in that situation. It's not actually learning Japanese. It's just awkwardly applying English backwards. And a lot of people like to ask because of that sort of thing, since it's very well advised in AJATT. If you're going to learn a verb, learn a target for that verb so you can differentiate what sort of definition that is, and ultimately, probably get an idea of a sentence with that verb in it. Even though quite often in Japanese they can just put a verb and it not matter, but that's probably not a good sentence for you. But in response to this, people often ask like, well, what if can I just learn packs of nouns, because nouns don't have anything? And no, one thing is because it doesn't actually give. It's the same thing. Even though nouns may not have such an action on other things, you exactly need to know when they're used. And I guarantee you, there will always be situations in which you're like, here's this word, it's used like this. Like even just connecting to other words is an important knowledge of its use. And there's a bunch of awkward things if you're just learning it with English on the back, because synonyms are not always synonymously used. If you don't have an example, you can't tell synonyms apart, which is kind of important because it can display tone, etc., etc. You don't want to accidentally use something that just seems really out of place in a conversation. And much of this could be solved with a single look at like Japanese dictionaries English sentences. It's not English example sentences. Like, I know many words that basically mean the after sign of something happened or a trace, and indeed relating this heavy relation of these words. I know like 4 of them, and they actually involve quite a lot of the use of the same kanji. But at least 1 or 2 of them are almost exclusively used in phrases that mean without a trace, and you can see this because like every dictionary example has that. So if you use that without using that, you just wouldn't know, because otherwise you're just making up information about how the word is used that you don't really know. And for other things, there are common words that are only used in set phrases, and sometimes those phrases don't use grammar. Like I know at least one phrase that like means to be, well, it's a word that if you put in a sentence means to be like extremely or no way higher extent than that. But the awkward thing is that it always comes at the end after the thing it's augmenting, unlike most adjectives. And so if you get that and see that in the native material, you'll immediately go, oh, okay, that's how it's used. If you learn it by itself in a vocabulary list, you will take forever to know that. And so you can see how you don't really know what that means. Also, another thing of like people who may be thinking too much about, oh man, different types of speaking language. Formal words, or words of particular tone, or words of specific dialect even. If you learn them in a sentence, you can see what other things are usually with them to display what tone that formality means, how much other formality you need in it. If you have trouble relaying dialects together, what words of what dialects go together, and you can mentally tie them just from seeing alongside each other without having to think about it later. Naturally, I mentioned Japanese dictionaries. You might be a bit confused there, but I'm going to briefly discuss the monolingual transition and the benefits. People call it monolingual transition. It's when people progress from making SRS cards that are a sentence on the front and the definition on the back, where the definition on the back is, of course, English. You always want to go from Japanese to English, not English to Japanese, because, of course, there's no English thing you're doing immersion from, and you never want to force English into Japanese, because that won't allow you to properly understand things. But the monolingual transition is when you turn all the materials you rely on, basically, most just dictionaries, really, into being Japanese dictionaries. Because then you can understand Japanese through Japanese. You can see what words Japanese people naturally think of when they try to describe other Japanese. And you can really avoid awful situations of like English synonyms screwing up. I remember when I still had old cards that I hadn't got to the monolingual transition yet. Like, there's one card I had that the English definition said quality, and what I thought that meant at the time that I made it was to mean an attribute of something. You know, a quality that something has, but actually it was in terms of the extent to which how good or bad something is. And I didn't know that until I finally saw the Japanese definition, because the English definition wasn't any more complicated. And I have a weird note here, but I don't know why it leads in. Music is not necessarily the best way to learn Japanese. I mean, you could use music to get in the mood, but it's basically about as useful as passive immersion, when you just have music play, well, when you have Japanese audio playing in your ear, but you're not doing anything with it. You're not really paying attention, you're doing something else. And because ultimately Japanese people don't sing how they speak otherwise, every note, like every vowel is very enhanced, where lots of things like extended vowels just flow into each other, and it's harder to pick up. It won't affect your ability to actually probably listen to things. Now, on to RTK itself. I'm surprised when people didn't previously know it. I already knew it, which is why it confused me, because I thought it was a generally talked about thing, but that might depend like entirely on where you're coming from. A few misconceptions about RTK that a lot of people try to bring up. I've seen videos where they try to just teach someone, here's a kanji, here's readings for it, here's some example words, etc., all that junk stuffed together. Where people respond to it saying, like, I'm just going to do Heisig. It is true that Heisig won't do much for you if you are indeed doing just that, because the point here is that it's the easiest way to get directly into the language without having to just see a bunch of letters you cannot take into your head because you haven't identified them hard enough. So a lot of people like to get down on Heisig, RTK, remembering the kanji, precisely because people say, like, well, I've done RTK, so now I know kanji, which is true depending on what you're trying to get out of it. Lots of people say they don't know kanji unless, like, the difference what people know kanji depends on what they think that is. And some people means, like, I know a word for every kanji, or if a kanji is the entire spelling for a word, I know that word with it, etc., etc. But as I mentioned, you want to get all your sentences from immersion itself, to avoid bringing up, like, you just bring too much baggage of English with you if you just learn, like, to even get, like, the standard use list of kanji, you would need to learn, like, 2,000 words. But the problem with that is that's also not necessarily the order of what's most useful, just getting one for each symbol, because some of the most used examples of any of the letters is something that's made of two at the same time, and there'll be no way to get around that if you're doing that method, just awkwardly sticking them together. The real advantage of RTK is you do use mnemonics and things to better make funny stories, which are really helpful to put them together, and discuss a bit of methods of how people do that in a minute. But the main goal can be described by this. Imagine if I told someone to learn their ABCs, but I didn't tell them that the sounds A, B, C, all the way to Z, were at all associated just with the letters. Of course they are. Of course they are in English. But I mean, the main thing that makes that easy is not that that just displays one of the sounds you make with that letter. It's that you have a label for it. If you learn kanji by themselves, all you do is stare at them until you get used to them. If you apply a general meaning from an English word of what they use, the kind of thing they use for, you would just end up using that as your ABC, and that's why it's so useful. Because whenever you do your test, you can just be told the word, and you go like, oh, that's this kanji. So matching the characters is like matching A with the A sound. If I just showed a bunch of kids here's A to Z and then said remember it, what would they even do to help trigger their remembrance? And a real point I want to bring out here is a lot of people would say like, but I don't need to write. Japan doesn't really need writing. Apart from that being wrong, Japan seems to surprisingly involve a decent amount of writing. Writing is better way to remember it. It's easier to remember it if you can write it, regardless of whether or not you plan to do any writing. I myself have rarely written a sentence, but I can write like over 3,000 of these doodly-doos that totally drive people insane just easily, and I learned most of them within like 3 months, because that's basically what it takes. And so all you need is these books, really. Maybe I'll get back to them as back to what you don't need in them in a second, because you might not actually be doing RTK by fully RTK because you only need that section. Maybe some people think like this isn't how children learn kanji. But I would like to bring up that Japanese children are fluent in the language before they can read, so learning a word along with its spelling is actually pretty abnormal for learning words in the stages before fluency in the wild. The fact that Japanese children are naturally going to learn new words with a spelling and a word in school really doesn't have anything to do with a natural sort of learning process. So you have to really acknowledge this is a tool for your own help, and you can only really complain about this if your plan is to learn like from listening and then deal with reading later, which would be a mildly better plan for some reasons that I will mention later. That's too much of saying the same thing. But some people indeed at the same time do think that the way children learn kanji is wrong. Wanikani also thinks this, and it's another section where I'm going to beat up on Wanikani. Wanikani says things like children learn kanji wrong because it's not the simplest to not simplest symbol. But it's probably because the order they learn kanji has more to do with the actual vocabulary that is associated with the words as they get older, and complexity, and not complexity of the kanji, because kanji have actual meaning. They're not ordered by complexity based on frequent usage or anything. Like obviously, this consequence means you spend ages on Wanikani learning words that are most common way later, but are far less of a strong memory to them than rarer words learned right away. But still in RTK you can learn things in the order of complexity just from the symbols, because you only learn the symbols, and this of course doesn't bring in as much baggage into the language by having you learn words in order that has nothing to do with how useful they are to you. There are words I learned on Wanikani that I still either have seen only once or not at all. It wasn't that they aren't useful. I think some of them are some of those are generally useful. I mean, Wanikani's vocab list is indeed picked out on words that are generally used, not that you learn them in the order that they're most useful. But it's just they haven't been useful to my experience of Japanese yet. My individual experience, what it's telling me is important words is words that I encounter most often. So if I just don't encounter those words, then of course they're not useful to me. So I don't need to learn them. There's no point learning them right now. That would just be forcing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. There's a point where I learned really why one kind of screwed up, at least for me, just in a normal way, not having to think about any of these things compared to AJATT, was because of the kanji complexity. I learned 2 or 3 words whose acceptable answers were things like world or society before I learnt the word for world that all weebs know. Ultimately, because all the ones I did know were simpler symbols, and usually just one symbol and maybe one symbol and connected with a symbol. That's no way of doing it. They're all symbols. I'm in kanji. And the one that most weebs know is, of course, 2-symbol one. But I hadn't learned the second character yet. And ultimately, this means that I know like 4 words that supposedly mean the same thing. But I know from Japanese immersion that they mean subtly quite different things. Some more about people's opinions in society, etc., how the world works. Whereas the one that weebs most have is more broad world, this is the place kind of thing. And this system gives no way of you differentiating that, because you'll need natural context to properly know those words. But I'd like to say that you will not need everything in RTK. This might confuse you, but you really only need the remembering the kanji bit. There are other bits in the kanji, like there are straight up vocab lists in the back of them. Ignore them. You do not need to learn them. It is against the point of why you're going to use them for AJATT. And Volume 2 is outright not needed. Volume 3 is kind of a bonus because it's not the general use list of kanji, but does indeed have a lot of ones that are surprisingly everyday use, but for some reason not in the general list. And together these will put you to over 3,000, and you can learn them in about 3 months. If you just learn like a certain amount of words every day. So you need vocab section. Volume 2 is not needed because it is only vocabulary, and of also these things also have a system for learning the readings, but you don't need to learn the readings. Not by themselves, anyway. If you learn a word off, like, just learn a word, you've learned the reading from knowing that word. You don't need to know, like, 3 readings for a single symbol and then guess what the word is, because if you're making a dictionary definition for the word, the pronunciation of it is right there. You just have to treat it individually, and then the benefits of learning the readings will build up afterwards, instead of confusing yourself from the beginning. I'd like to say how not to make RTK cards before I maybe focus on how to make them. Pre-made decks aren't advised, because pre-made decks are generally bad. Inputting your own cards make your memory far better, and if you use pre-made decks, you probably won't encourage yourself to make your own mnemonic stories. I, however, well, you need to write it out. You make your own stories, and you need to write it out each time. The front of the card is the English word, and then you need to use your mnemonic to figure out what symbol this produces, then write it out every time you test it, and then that'll work. I used a pre-made deck. I used the same one used by Brit vs Japan, who was not Matt vs Japan, but Brit vs Japan plays a core role in my AJATT experience, as I explain later. Is one made by Kanji Cooley, and I actually had to update it for RTK Volume 3 because it wasn't the most up-to-date version. If you get these books, you want them to be the same version, or if you use that pre-made deck, which probably recommended by most people, make sure it's the latest editions version of these books, because then you won't have to edit some of the things later. There are some changes to what symbols are labelled as what, otherwise it's not really relevant. The Kanji Cooley ideas had a lot of great story ideas, but the ultimate thing is that I adapted those to what made better sense to me. Adapting them to yourself is what really gets it to you. Like, trying to learn someone else's story might be good enough. Sometimes the story is really obvious and simple, so it works well enough. And some of them are just offensive, so it's easy to learn. Brit vs Japan used lazy kanji, as I mentioned before, because it's mentioned by cats, and that's far similar to wanikani because you have the kanji on the front and the word guessed on the back, and also no writing. This was, of course, faster because of no writing, but this is bad because it teaches you to not be able to write the kanji from memory, which is really a greater thing to do. Being able to see it and interpret meaning for it is good, but the thing you want to aim for is the ability to write it out of your head. And so because of this... Sorry, I did a cut because the maximum thing on Windows Movie Maker. Anyway, lazy kanji is naturally more attractive to me because it's more like wanikani, while somewhat avoiding certain problems with wanikani that I identified before, which is mostly learning the meanings of sentences. But now I realise the problem with learning wanikani with the symbol at the top and the definition at the bottom. But of course, wanikani can't have an input for you to just write a thing, because that would be way too complicated. So just write it out on a piece of paper. But ultimately, yeah, I'm glad I didn't do it, because Brit vs. Japan ended up regretting that, because he ultimately, after all this time, had to restart doing that. Because no matter, if he saw the symbols, he could totally understand it, but no matter what, he couldn't just start writing it out of his head, because he hadn't learnt them in that way around, and also like had done no writing, so he didn't know the general way to write them. I can write them all perfectly fine. I mean, my deck is generally on a rotation of 90% of over 3,000 symbols are always at mature. So I can write them out generally fine and with correct stroke order. There is this minor point that some of the stroke diagrams in Heisig are actually wrong, and so I recommend looking them up on like Jisho or Daijirin or something. I made somewhat a mistake of trying to match the speed Brit promotes with 2 months to learn kanji, which is probably only volume 1, because if you do like 30 a day or something, that's probably the maximum of the recommendation. I actually did 35. Probably a bit rough, but I managed it. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to other people, and because he didn't do writing, it made that it's far more convenient of a goal for him. So at this point, after having explained those things, I'd like to give a general flowchart of the journey. There's one that seems to be made in paint that when people are reminded of it in Matt versus Japan's Discord, some people laughed because some people had never seen it before. But it's basically you do the RTK bit while constantly doing as much active immersion as possible. Probably just watching things, because playing games might not be as useful, things like that. Reading certainly won't be able to really do. And what you do is you don't do any sentence mining, which is taking those sentences out of the things you've seen or watched, until you're done with RTK. Because you want to focus on RTK all the time, not struggle with both of them at once. Later on, it becomes easier and you can just do it. Be focused on that, much listening as possible, and after that you can start reading, basically. And then the rest of it is just constant immersion for like 18 months. The goal is but it's like a maximum of like 10,000 hours, which I guess like 18 months or something. It may be that RTK doesn't count. I've heard stories recently that Cat's 18 months didn't include the possible 3 months time for RTK, and depending on how much time you actually have, depending on your other responsibilities, it may take longer than that. And so the basic goal is to, at that point, have sentence mined like 10,000 sentences. That is the goal that most people doing AJATT will be aiming for. And I will tell you how far I've made it in my time once I get to my progress. But you'll see that I'm pretty on time for this. But that's kind of the rough of it. It doesn't really go into any more detail on that. Whereas Matt vs. Japan has a bit more of an updated one with details of like different years, etc. Have it right here, and I'll briefly run over it. Stage 1 is beginner, brackets 1 year, laying the groundwork 1 month, get educated, pick a method, learn about it, gain deep understanding of it, set up a consistent sleep schedule. And because his method includes meditation as a great suggestion for getting focused on everything, which is not at all a bad thing. I haven't done it myself, but it'd be really good for focusing and dealing with the big project ahead of you. So by The Mind Illuminated, by a name I can't read, read up to stage 4, start meditating 5 minutes a day, first thing in the morning, increase meditation time by 5 minutes a week until reaching 1 hour per day, and then load up on native media, start immersion, learn hiragana and katakana. I didn't mention that there's a Heisig book for learning hiragana and katakana. I learned them in a different way. If you just learned them already, there's no suffering. It can be done pretty easily. So that first is 1 month. The next step for 4 months is RTK 1 and 3. Do 25 a day by his recommendation. Continue to immerse. Try to learn from context. Also try to recognize words and look up what they mean. As a beginning step, it's totally acceptable if you just hear a word a lot and you want to look up that one word's meaning. That's fine, because you probably don't know much in terms of getting full sentences. And I'll cover a bit more of how you get around this in the next section, because you might be wondering, where do I make full sentences from if I only know a few words? But continue to immerse, try to learn from context, blah, blah. Next 1 month section is basic grammar. This is what I'm going to mention in the next section. As much as I've said that I'm going to probably say that grammar isn't super needed, but the general thing here is to go through Tai Kim's grammar guide, which is just on the internet, it's free, you don't have to buy any textbooks or anything, and make a sentence card for each example sentence, and that will get you a decent starting vocabulary and a basic understanding. You don't really need anything more basic grammar to do anything, of which I will go more into a bit later as well. Then you do bilingual sentences, which are how you refer to as Japanese on the front and the English on the back. Do like approximately 2,500 of those. It makes me feel better, because some people said about 1,000, but I was more around 2,500 when I ultimately started doing the backwards process of searching within those words, like trying to change those definitions, and if I don't know all the words in those definitions, making that card into a new card and doing definitions for that. But you don't want to get too deep into that. And ultimately I want to replace those cards afterwards. It's just an in-between that isn't very useful. And do that, so you get roughly 2,500 for 4 months. Sentence mine, anime drama with J-subs, Japanese subs, obviously, or manga, and make bilingual sentence cards. Aim for 20 a day, should take 4 months. Then the monolingual sentences is 2 months after that. Make the monolingual transition and start only adding 10 cards a day. Can bump this up to 15 once you become skilled at using a Japanese dictionary. Stage 2 is another year, continue, like second year. Continue immersing and making monolingual sentence cards. Learn pitch accent theory. Start learning pitch accent words. Once you master anime with Japanese subs, manga, start branching into visual novels and light novels, and eventually real novels. Stage 3, which is another year, is start outputting, start learning literally every word you come across. Start seeking out weak spots and immerse what you need, not just with what is fun. And stage 4 is from fluent to native level and beyond. Continue to fill holes in knowledge. Adopt a parent for a type of person you see in Japanese media who can more mimic their style of speaking, etc. Start studying culture, history, and linguistics, and learn classical Japanese. So you can see from this more updated model that I'll probably aim for about 3 years for the full straight-on package. 18 months with AJATT in about full-time is, well, maybe not full-time as I'm just talking, but decent amount of time to it, will be basic fluency to the point of like understanding 90% of what you see and hear. There might be a few fallbacks on this, which I'll explain in a minute. But of course, from this you've begged, when do you do grammar? Of course, the question's been answered. After months of pure listening, immersion, RTK will take you using Tai Kim. And points I'd like to make here is you won't need really any more than that. I didn't use Tai Kim because I already had things hanging over. advanced grammar isn't needed, and grammar is generally a trap, in my opinion. That's why after you've gotten a little used to the language, is better, because you don't approach the language from the grammar you've learnt. You start with no assumptions, and then ultimately use grammar to like make you notice the things you've seen, not to use grammar to pre-prescribe the things you're going to see. I have a particular academic example for why learning grammar and things it just kind of gets in the way, because academia gets in the way. Because people want to make it as easy to explain as possible. Like, for example, I have an A level, which is the highest thing you can get outside of a university degree, in electronics. And anyone that studies everyone studies like basic science, which everyone will know that electricity flows from plus to minus. But everyone that studied further than that, like me with my A-level electronics, know in fact it actually flows from minus to plus. You'll also learn this in A-level physics. You may know this or may not know this, but the point I'm trying to bring up here is that this fact, which is a fact when you first learn it, becomes not only wrong, but the opposite when you come back to it later, entirely because it's considered easier to learn the first thing, and so that is what you'll be tested on in tests, even though it's not actually true. This isn't necessarily a thing that will happen in grammar, but the point is that to make things as easy as possible to you, they'll put out, this is how it works, and the important thing is that there'll always be an exception to that, and you'll have to get to that, and you have to get the complicated points where people say, well, actually, I said this broad thing, but let's get to more right details now, etc., etc. And you're going to build a reliance on that if you go into that too much. Advanced grammar is more to do with rarity than complexity. You're just taught in order of how normal it is. But this belief can also have you thinking that using it is therefore special, or things learned many lessons later aren't still foundational parts of the language used every day. And you're only going to be able to measure that, of course, if you're doing immersion. And for the thing I briefly mentioned, like, grammar requires being complete. That's kind of why people want it, because they want to feel complete and that they understand everything, but it's never going to complete. If you get into the nitty-gritty of it, you can just get books about whole differences between two particles, and that's what grammar really is, because it's ultimately trying to find out how language works and properly describe it to people. But the problem is you don't actually need that to get it right, though. You don't need to be conscious of all these things. If you're just used to them, you don't know anything else. It doesn't matter. And grammar itself avoids change if you start studying it too hard. I think a decent amount of bit about how my own language works and how some things are stupid through having studied Japanese up to this point. And one of the things I'd like to bring up is, like, in Japanese there isn't really I and me, there's just I. Whereas in English we have I and me. I would like you to right now take a guess. You might not be able to do it right away unless you've thought about it a bit. But what do you think are actually the different situations where you use I and me? I came to the conclusion that me is a reference to yourself where you are the target of an action. Like, he killed me, he shot me. But if you're but in any other situation, you can use I. You go like, I shot him, blah blah blah, right? And because of this, I actually sort of understood one thing. It's a very common, like, sort of uptight thing that people who are more specific about English grammar, who've learned, like, deliberately learned English grammar themselves as an English-speaking person, and like English teachers do, where you say he and I, but every English speaker just says, like, him and me. Or, like, let's say him and I is what you want. Like, you say him and me. And I think the exact reason why they hate that, as far as I could tell, I haven't looked it up, so this could be total bullshit, it's precisely because that means you have to start adding more rules just to say that exception. Imagine teaching that exception. It's like, oh, by the way, when English speakers say this, they use me instead of I, even though it's wrong. Just imagine that. Imagine, like, having to learn that in class and not forget it. Whereas if you just saw it, there wouldn't be any question in your mind, because it would be the only way you've ever seen that said. And most likely if you saw the other way, you would see that people are saying it formally, or someone's correcting someone. In this way, grammar often has the illusion of being the bones for a language. This builds the illusion that you just slap on vocabulary,
without regard to how well that sounds. It's why people think the height of their grammar really matter. Words actually matter more than grammar, because grammar is just what appears from words. And ultimately, even if you know all the grammar, if you don't have a decent amount of words, you don't do anything. But if you learn them isolated vocabulary lists, you don't actually know the proper way they really use and connect. So you sort of have the bones, but you're not even using the bones right. You use the bones as a necessary tool, when in reality, bones appear through other words' usage. And so words themselves matter more than grammar in the long run. Sometimes non-grammatical usage of words is normal. Again, the difference between I and me. Not having interaction with the language in the wild to learn this is why if I, like... Imagine if I posted something on, like, learn Japanese. People might tell me I know nothing if I just start speaking like a random young person, because there's a few bits of, like, mild slang or specific words that just break basic conjugation rules just because they sound easier to say. And that's how those things have evolved. I mean, it's not a big pattern, it's like a few words. If I said those, I just wonder how many people would come out, like, of the shadows to backstab me and go, look, you fucked up. And I just be like, no, like, here's an example from just a comic. And they'd be like, what the hell is this? Why are Japanese people getting Japanese wrong? I even have another anecdote, because it's happened so many times in comments of AJATT's videos. There's an anecdote of people waving around their grammar level. I mentioned how Brit vs. Japan comes in, why his name is so awkwardly near to Matt vs. Japan, because he naturally followed after him. And they're both called Matt, so thank God. Thank God he's Brit vs. Japan, because he's English. But since he's done now, he's done by the time I started. I mean, done in terms of, like, basic fluency, but he's still doing AJATT. He made, like, a video, and some guys, like, respond, like, I got damn bored after 3 minutes of you whittling on about arrant garbage. And to be fair, I wouldn't blame someone's comment on this video, because if you've gone this far, you've really dedicated yourself. But he spelt minutes wrong, so Brit vs. Japan, just being a cheeky Nando's, responded with, like, a correction of minutes and nothing else. And so the guy just bit back straight with, so what? Unlike you, I live in Japan and for 55 years have done nothing but write and speak Japanese, so I make some English spelling mistakes. How's your Japanese grammar? Mine's N1, referring to the JLPT N1, which is basically the highest test most Japanese learners can imagine, but it doesn't really have anything to do with being good. Like, honestly, if you've lived in Japan and 55 years done nothing but write and speak Japanese, I mean, imagine it could be pretty good. Like, you don't need to bring that up. I mean, maybe it's just the best thing, but people just having a laugh, just like going, thinks that's good? Like, N1 is good? I mean, it's the highest of the things that people imagine, so it must be good, but it's just not good compared to, like, actually understanding Japanese. Like, just straight up put this. I'll just put together the kind of stats we got going here. Sorry for the time taken to write this. Right, so grammar is N1 and Brit vs. Japan is this is where editing will come in handy. So yeah, some guy, grammar is N1. Brit vs. Japan, his reading and listening is at can, which I think is pretty good. But maybe it's not good as N1 grammar. I don't know, it's up to you. Honestly, I question anyone who thinks grammar is like the hard part of the language. I'd like to think that says something actually about how much you really understand of the language you're studying. Because, I mean, grammar is just basically words that mean a function that's outside of, like, a normal word, or like group the words around it, or make things go in a certain order, etc., etc. Or sometimes it's just awkward conjunctions that are just rare. So it doesn't really mean anything. I don't think about grammar at all anymore, and I'm not even fluent. Like, when I read a sentence now, it's not... If I don't understand it, it's not because I don't know the relevant grammar. It's because I don't know the words. I can see how... Japanese is like the easiest thing to see all the constructions and orders in it. Because it has such great grammar, I guess. But you don't need, like, anything really complicated to understand that sort of level. If you honestly think grammar is the necessary fundamentals of language, why even bring it up to show off? Because after all, it's still the fundamentals. Like, ultimately, that's why getting into fights like this just gets worse. Because, like, you can't even pick out certain words. Like, if there's probably certain words that people who learn language from textbooks know that I don't. It doesn't mean they're better than me, it just means they know a certain word. And I haven't found it yet, or haven't found a sentence I can use for it yet, or... You know, just haven't really found it useful, so it also isn't badly affecting me. Like, do people have that sort of mindset, know where they're going, or do they just stop after grammar is done? Have they moved on to revising pre-made Anki vocab decks made by some anonymous stranger for more words? Are they just typing English words into the internet to get what is the hopeful Japanese equivalent and making a one-word to one-word flashcard on it? Like, native speakers don't bring up their grammar education. They just talk. If you're someone that can supposedly talk, it only matters if real Japanese people think you can. Real life doesn't care about grades. If anyone watching, like, these videos that thinks, but my grammar, or is someone that asks, but do I really have to do so-and-so? I mean, it seems kind of difficult. So what I have to say is nothing but, like, the advice that people... who look for AJATT, for AJATT is about what works. You can avoid any part of it if you feel like it, as long as you're aware that, like, that way is probably just better. And to not do it is probably wasting your time in the long run, if not immediately. If you start caring about anyone on the internet that, like, talks about these things like this, enough to ask them that sort of question, or to have arguments about it on forums, I want you to realise that neither I, or rather anyone that's actually done an AJATT, or a teacher, can ever give you a piece of paper that says you did it. No qualification will matter. If you go up to a Japanese person and they get the impression that you're just not good enough to talk to outside of language learning forums, then I can't give you a piece of paper that you can show to them to say, actually, I'm pretty good. Because it doesn't matter in real life. Ask yourself what you do if it was the other way around. When you ask someone, do I really have to? Or think, but I have X qualification. What are you asking listeners? But will you give me the grade if I just do this much? And the answer is, there was never a grade in the first place. There is do and can't. The time between is for study. If you get fluent, there will probably be do but shit for a while. Like, the more and more you get proficient at ironing out the real problems. While I'm not qualified to talk much about that result at this point, it's not at all equal to forming never-before-used sentences in your head from grammar rules while imitating sounds you've never heard. Learning a language is learning how the language is natively used, not convincing yourself that you've learned enough basics to just make the rest of it up upon revising one-word to one-word flashcards, and telling yourself children's books will be your reward upon miraculously attaining fluency of a language you never see with explanations written underneath it. Never see without the explanations written underneath it. Anyone doing the latter would probably consider that do but shit level some sort of magic, and have the idea that fluency is just done, which is probably not the case. There's still things to do after it, really, because they can't imagine that sort of situation, or understand that that but shit part is entirely from self-reflection, that that person knows they still have a gap between them and a native. Like, honestly, sometimes I put a grammar word or phrase into Google to see what results Weblio, my preferred dictionary, will give me to choose from, rather than typing into Weblio itself, because that will limit it entirely to what I've interpreted to be the ends of those things are, when sometimes it finds out that more of the information was necessary for that phrase, etc. And sometimes just got first result, learn JLPTN1 grammar. All I did was type in Japanese phrase. And I started laughing at how little it has to do with any difficulty. The few things that were built up on required previous knowledge were straight up things that if you knew the parts that make it should be readily obvious. And I only saw those results because they showed up when I had made a typo, or if Google thought that was more related. It's annoying. If you type a single Japanese word into Google, you are far more likely to get grammar sites or threads on language learning forums about what it means, all in English. Details... never mind. Anyway, it didn't flow very well, but finally after, what is an hour and a half, to get to me, my general progress and stats. I've been doing AJATT full-time since the beginning of June 2017, and I mean full-time as much as possible. I don't have a job. I mean, it's a very convenient thing to say, but I'll describe a few other things about my circumstances later. But yeah, I do AJATT full-time. I've been doing it since then. I've been doing at least passive listening for pretty much 24/7, with a gap of only as big as opticians or dentist appointment or the occasional phone call. I also do it in my sleep, keeping the earphones on with tape every night. So I actually bought new tape today in a 3 for 2 bargain. It's nice. It's microporous pharmaceutical tape for putting up gauze or something. There's mine, and if you're in England, you can fully get on the. You can't see the size. It's from Boots. It's 2.5 centimeter times 10 centimeter. I literally put it over my ears every night, take it off in the morning, and then have to wash my ears because my ears get a bit sticky. I'm probably thinking this is something. Well, having things on your ears while you sleep is mildly recommended on AJATT. Advice is pretty much if it stops you sleeping, it's not worth it, because sleeping is dangerously good. One of the things people generally say about AJATT is get a good sleeping schedule. It really will affect you. There's amount of days where I've just had a terrible day because I just didn't have enough sleep and I just couldn't fix it until that night. So I just did worse. But it's not for any kind of sleep teaching effect. It's just so when I go to sleep and when I get up, I'm getting the most out of my time. I'm still listening to something and making progress. This doesn't really affect me too much either, because I used to be a person that fell asleep with the TV, whereas other people aren't used to that. I'm actually rather a person that finds dead silence to be far harder to relax in. I did try wireless for a while, actually. Got some good cheap wireless ones. They did stay on quite well. The problem is that the battery life doesn't really last a good amount of sleep. It's about 7 hours, and it just kind of cuts it. And just try to help you just properly understand here. I'm going to take a picture of my Anki deck right in front of me, so you can get it straight up. My sentence deck. Okay, the lighting's terrible, but last time I checked this, I managed to get it to work. So it says... it says Japanese sentence deck, and damn, it's getting difficult. I managed to get it to work before, but the top line, well, it's not good. The bottom line, which is the total there, says 6,917. So I'm pretty on goal, but there are certain things wrong with my speed that I think you'll discover. As for my Kanji deck, it's got a bit more than just what's in those books, since I found some things. They're usually ones that are only using a single word and nothing else, but those words came up enough, so I was like, screw it. So I have 3,061, of which 90% are currently mature, and 10% are unmature. It means 300 are unmature, which sounds like a lot, but it's That's a good percentage to kind of have from what I've seen people say, specifically Matt, because if you actually have all of them like near like 100%, it's probably a sign that you're doing something wrong in how you're checking them off. Next thing. Oh yeah, all my cards are in Japanese now. It's probably pretty obvious, but even my old cards have Japanese definitions now. They still have the English definitions in some cases, because otherwise it's not really testing the same thing I had then, but I have at least added Japanese definitions to them. As for my RTK notebook, I want that friend that with the Overwatch thing that told me how good they are, and I was trying to explain RTK to them. Weirdly enough, at that point, Twitter didn't take 4 images at once for some reason at that time. So here's my RTK notebook. I actually bought 3 of these notepads and haven't even finished one. It's been over a year, but it does just fall apart, and like half of this is loose, just loose pages. About 8 pages in like the half month I'd done that point, and learned 500 kanji. And my friend was just like, "You'll forget them all." I was like, "No, I won't. I mean, maybe I did a bit too many, but I didn't do bad." And they were just saying things to me like, "Well, trust me, I know how this works. I learned all the kana in 3 days." And I literally made a video responding to them about me writing kana from never like learning how to write them, because the stroke order became easy from learning kanji, and totally got the stroke order right. And I mean, like, I have some problems remembering kana at this point. I have a kana deck, especially because I learned kana from looking at boxes of Japanese toys I bought, because that's the kind of guy I am. And I managed to learn them in 3 days during the thing. I'll go in more detail about that. But this is what it generally looks like if I just get out the pages. It's not super neat, but just pages and pages of this. The further you go on, it gets more complicated naturally, because you get a mix of a whole lot of different things of different sizes. So these are naturally the same ones over and over again, as you can see. But on this side, it's just absolute chaos. I mean, there's a lot of thick scribbles out when I get them wrong, because I want to say to myself that's wrong. But like, yeah, it's just how it goes, and that's that many. I do this every day. I do about 80 of those every day. When I showed it to my friend with like 8 tweet thing of the 8 pages I'd done, they're just like, "Oh, your hand must hurt." It's like, I've been to school. Writing like a third of a page worth of symbols in one day is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Doesn't hurt your hand at all. As for my immersion level, well, it's very true to say that I know I've been spending most of the time looking at myself, how I appear in the thing. I know it's been awkward the entire time, but it's very easy to say that just because you're in the pool doesn't mean you're swimming. But for my immersion level of how little English things I take in, since I have no one any English shows or anything, my Twitter is in Japanese, and I unfollowed everyone that is English on it, so I just have like mostly like over 1,000 Japanese artists. I don't go on Facebook much, so my immersion level is like, as you can tell, I'm English. It's probably obvious by this point, with no difficulty. Years ago there was a royal wedding. This year there was another royal wedding. Apparently it started getting really talked about since like, I don't know, like, people told me August of last year. But actually I've been doing AJATT since June of last year till July this year. So I didn't find out about the royal wedding until the day it happened. And that was only because the morning of the day it happened, my computer's power supply broke, so I had to leave the house. And so I got a ride from my family. And when my family took me for the ride, they'd said to me, I'm so tired of seeing things about the royal wedding to me. I explained it right there. That is the only reason I know the royal wedding exists, happened at all. The next day I found out that they became the Duke and Duchess of the county that I live in. That's my level of immersion. And like, if you do immersion a lot, like, I end up thinking in English in my head a lot lately, just about things, so things mildly suffer. But recently, when I was doing my studying in the morning, doing my deck of my cards, I thought of things like, I forgot how to spell bought. I was like, should be obvious, and I thought about weird things like the stupid like phonetic spelling and things, and briefly, and then after I managed to remember it again, I was just like, why is it the past tense of buy? Like, I couldn't understand. Like, Japanese is so much simpler in verb conjugations, whereas in English, it's just like, oh, here's another word. Why? It's just like, so sometimes that happens to me. I mean, in immersion, like ages ago, it doesn't happen now as often because there might be certain problems that I'll go through. But like sometimes I just think like, oh man, that's very. I want to say a Japanese word here. That's wrong. I don't want to say a Japanese word either. I mean, I've said some in this video just for ease of explaining, but like I generally don't want to be saying anything because I'd probably just be solidifying the way I say it. At this point, actually, I've probably read more books in Japanese than I have in English now, since I didn't like reading as a kid. I've only read about one fictional book all the way through by choice in my life, because I was just bad at it as a kid. If you bear with me a sec, I'll actually go to Book Live, and I'll ask Book Live how many books it says I own. So I'll go to. So these electronic books, so you understand, but like. iPage. Oh man, it's harder than I thought it was. I'll go to the internet page. I'm so sorry. This is something I forgot to prepare. Right, my library. It's far easier than on the mobile. My library has a speech bubble above it that says 316. Keep in mind that it counts individual volumes of comics. So, you know, some of these are books. That, well, don't have pictures. Some pictures. Some of the things I haven't actually read. Some things I've bought. Some things are like free reading periods of books. Just to keep those into account. At this point, though, I generally like. I'll get more into what I read, but I have read self-help books in Japanese. This is how much of a non-big deal it is for me at this point. So why I hated reading as a child? Actually, as a child, you know what? I had pretty bloody good... Sorry, I just turned extremely English. I had pretty damn good vocabulary. Just ambitious, stupid. At one point, I was really good at spelling. Like, I said that I don't know any word I can't spell, which was... you know, primary school, big deal. When I got into secondary school, my vocabulary was big enough that it just seemed to show off. So I just came across, probably easily came across with dick, because it's nice to use fancy words. And this is entirely because I watched so much TV. That's what I generally did when I was at home, I just watch TV. I barely read books. I read a lot. I mean, internet, blah, 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 but I don't read books. There's never really any point when I read books. Although maybe because this once in secondary school some other kids approached me I didn't know as they approached me as the American kid. So I imagine I must have picked up pronunciation without really noticing it. No one else really said this sort of thing, so maybe I just said something that seemed a bit American, but I don't know. I do have a bit of some Americanisms, but that's probably because they just build up over old English words at this point. And, you know, since I'm usually doing AJATT, like, a decent point is, I usually have a really big beard, and I'm fine with it, but it looked bad on camera, and I shaved it, to prepare for this video. It's a lot of groundwork of preparing this video, actually, like, at least over a week. And I also didn't like my cleanly shaved face. So what you have now is me with weird short stubble. And that actually looks surprisingly good. It doesn't look as good as my hair at all in this lighting. So ultimately, where I hope to be while I'm doing this is I am actually trying to go and live in Japan. And I'll get into the reasons for that. But basically, go in Japan through the JET program to get some time in there, to get some funds, and you know, and then use my free time with my ability to speak Japanese to spread my wings and like just go into like in-house translation or something. And that sounds like a really good thing. I think that's the type of career I could really be proud of. And after all, if you're going to put this much work into something, making a career is not at all a bad thing. It's also quite a natural thing for many people in this situation. It's the sort of thing can write your life. Because actually it's going to take a lot of your time, so do you want to make the best of it? So for a little background of how I got here, it's going to be ages. A little background of how I got here. My initial motivation for learning Japanese, because it's quite complicated. I am 24. I'm actually older than Matt vs Japan by a year, and unlike him, I didn't start learning Japanese until now, which he started learning Japanese in high school. So I had, of course, dreams and things. I have gone to university. I've even done a master's year, but I ended up dropping out. Ultimately, I was doing it in a weird way. A lot of the people that stood for Matt vs Japan learn Japanese have a programming background, and I certainly did describe early ways of learning Japanese as definitely feeling like doing programming in a weird way. Get into a bit of reason why that is. It's mostly conjugations are fucking awesome. But I went to university for video games, and ultimately, like, maybe I expected too much university. Ultimately, it's just, you know, you do rely on yourself, but like, if you rely on yourself, like, how much university you need, etc., etc. Because ultimately your own work does it. I mean, there's facilities are really gonna make a difference, and there wasn't. Yeah, there's some facilities, but kind of show off things. But I ended up, even though it was the only thing I could imagine myself doing in my life, I just ended up losing motivation for a lot of reasons, and I screwed up my grade a bit. But if I had masters, then only the master grade mattered. But in masters, I struggled, and I just ultimately dropped out. So I have a terrible 2-2 degree, which I can make use of in using the JET program, but otherwise, I just kind of want to burn it. But after that, I just spent a year just being unemployed at home, having nothing to do, because nothing was satisfying, because it was just like, how do I progress my life? What am I doing? Where am I going? And so I started trying to apply for jobs, naturally. Just anything, like small things. I was trying to take pretty much anything that didn't involve, like, caring for the elderly, because I might end up, like, touching poop. Like, stuff like that. I straight up applied for a job of picking up trash at like 6 hours a week or something, in a way that totally probably couldn't keep me alive. I got into the interview, but I just didn't get it. I've applied for the same corner shop twice in like the same 6 months, where they changed management. First time I didn't get an interview, the second time I did, and the guy went, actually, I think you're a great guy. But I just don't think you answered well on this customer question. Like, yeah, it kind of blindsided me. I just didn't think of customers' needs then. For other things, it's just, like a mixture of I've no work experience, but I've got a degree, so I'm overqualified and underexperienced. And even though I'm willing to take basically any level of retail, they just won't give it to me. Like, since I have a thing in games, and so they asked me what my degree was in games when I applied for a sweet shop, a shop that sells candy, right? It's like, I work in games. And I'm just like, oh, you know, gamers next door, game shop. Like, tons of people say this sort of thing to me when I was having trouble with a job. It's just like, so you just rub me out because you think my ability to maybe make games means I should be selling them? And some will say things like older people will actually say, like, oh, you work with computers, so why don't you fix computers? But naturally, I couldn't respond to that with, like, well, if that's how it works, then any out-of-work person who owns a car should be a mechanic. They obviously know how to do it. Or, like, any out-of-work artist, they should work in a pencil factory. It just makes sense, doesn't it? But I just ultimately couldn't get anything. And so I ended up, like, around my birthday, just... it was the time Amazon Japan allowed shipping of things to other countries, more generally, a wider range of things, that like any complicated tax things. And so I just went to myself, oh, you know what? There's a more recent comic adaptation of that thing that I like unreasonably from my childhood and still do. And it's just like the only thing it has in English is fan translations. About the same, and that was this. It's right here, Gundam Wing, Endless Waltz, Glory of Losers, which is just basically a better version of the TV series with some minor jump ahead in the early parts, with the different Gundam designs. And I gave myself the goal. I also bought at the same time this new compact version of Gantz. There's surprising in the amount of chapters in it. Like, usually the volume of Gantz is about 10. This one has 22 chapters. And that's just ridiculous. It's tiny. It's tiny. It's my hand. So with this, I gave myself the goal of going, you know what, I'm just give myself a challenge, keep myself occupied. I'll learn enough Japanese so I can read this one series. And so what I did is I used this to learn a box of Kamen Rider toys to learn kana in 3 days, easily memorize them because I've seen them so much, just reading through it, not really reading, just seeing the symbols, matching them, and playing that game to myself. And it became really easy to differentiate what different kind of characters were what. You know, different 3 categories. Because I learned kana I learned kata first, then hero, and then after that I was just into some different phases of learning methods. Like, one of the first main things I did, which I owe a decent amount to, in a classic method, even though I wouldn't really recommend necessarily overall for learning language. Like, there's a language for learning Japanese called Japanese Ammo. It's just nice Japanese teacher. Her dream is to teach Japanese to English people, and that's what she's doing. And ultimately, like, I learned basic grammar from that, from the beginning, nothing really else. Learned I goddamn love Japanese conjugations. Like, I probably wouldn't have started AJATT unless I had already been, like, formally told through that, like, that amount of information. So while I want to recommend raw AJATT, so you have nothing as much going into it, I can feel, of course, that you might want to have something to tell you that, like, oh, I can actually like this before I just jump straight into it. Because you might find the language terrible, but I think most people who study Japanese find it to be quirky and beautiful at the same time. And perfectly great for programmers because of things like particles just being sick, because they just override any sentence order. And sometimes I would listen to, like, Japanese from Zero playlists in the background while playing Warframe to try and pass the time. And, like, I never bought the books, so sorry, George. I've never bought a textbook for learning Japanese. I've only ever used online resources. I've bought some books, like, here's a particle book, but apart from that, never bought a textbook for Japanese. Because they depreciate, like, cars. Everyone who does AJATT regrets they ever bought a beginning book because they run past it so quickly and they never use it, and they just sell it, and they sell it for, like, pence after they spend so much on it. And I started watching. Main motivation for where I want to go is I started like watching some J vloggers, which is a bit sad, but naturally the best one is abroad in Japan, and I can relate to him because of course I am another Englishman that runs on sarcasm. But naturally, I decided that experience, Jet sound good. Like I could use what I have to just like take a year off or something, get some work experience, and ultimately become a more well-rounded person. And so I decided that, well, take that year teaching to get work experience, have fun, have money, and then continue wherever else after that. So it's a nice way the hobby led into this. It's actually where I learned about RTK, because his method, he had a video of becoming fluent Japanese in 6 months. I mean, that's bullshit, but like his method was do Genki, do speaking, which isn't a good idea, but have a Japanese tutor for it regularly, and like 6 months is just how you pace learning everything in Genki, and that's not really great. And then after that, it's just like immersion, which I think he understands because he has good use of SRS, and that's even where I learned SRS too, because he could just input words, but he's probably not doing them in the best way you can, like how I explained. But straight up at this point, it was like, maybe I should try that. I didn't buy Genki though. The much dreaded Genki 2,000 word core deck is just what I started doing, because it's recommended doing that alongside the book, but I just went, fuck the book, I don't care about spending that much money. So I got the 2K core deck, and I was, do you know what saved this terrible step is that I was bored to hell immediately. Like as soon, like 2 words in, it's like hello, goodbye, excuse me, and I want to beat up on that core deck and decks made like that for just things like that. Like there's that word in Japanese that probably, I'm going to write it down, that generally means excuse me, or it's translated as excuse me, it's probably the better way of putting it, because I don't want to say it, so write it out. I should have it written on the screen so I could just make it better for me. I'm worse at writing kana from memory than I am at kanji. So this word, naturally just had excuse me or something underneath it, right? Like, that bored me, but now at that point I also know that there's more subtle things than that, because I had I've read stupid Wanikani articles about the subtle things that this word can mean, but I'm like, at least that made me go that's not the end of it. This is too much of a simple view to just say this means excuse me. There's another word that I guarantee you is very common and will be translated by most things as excuse me. But the trouble is these 2 words are not synonyms. They have synonymous use in certain situations, but I can think of at least one situation, I think, that's at least more broadly used with the other one. And so they're just different words, and you have to accept that. But I imagine if I got to that one other thing, it would just also be excuse me, which tells me nothing. Doesn't spins it out too much. But around this time that I just thought to myself, that learning, if I'm going to go there, the motivation for more learning is that while I'm there, I want to make the best out of use of my time that I can in this hypothetical 1-year period or beyond. And so began months of Wanikani. And I thought it was great. I mean, it mentioned loads of things. It mentioned RTK. It's an SRS. It's got all the vocabulary in it, but as mentioned, it's a bit crap. I do appreciate the more thought it gave me about certain seeing symbols and the radicals to make them, etc. But it is ultimately itself still not the best way to do it, and the other ways would just be far simpler. And also, you wouldn't have to rely on Wanikani for the rest of your life to keep those words if you just had them in an SRS. So months of that, so about a September to a February, it's a decent way invested into Wanikani. If I finished Wanikani, I bet you I would have a way harder time starting AJATT. because I would have gone insane. Which is why beginners need to know that this shit sucks. Because the more you commit to a method, the less time you want to change. But around February, I just randomly Brit vs Japan's video of him just getting to the 18-month video diary of AJATT. And it's like, oh man, okay. I mean, it's just a video guy saying something. But look for sort of videos like, okay, that video's the whole point. It's probably not just screwing me over. And it's weird how just random recommended video on YouTube can just change things. So I dropped everything. After that, like, I read the AJATT table of contents in a couple days. And I was just like, yeah. I went to Matt vs Japan's channel, looked at the resources, like, yeah. It makes sense. I can't believe it. It's like, things become so simple and you can argue them so easily, but it's just because they're not the way that everyone does by going to class and hopefully getting good one day, that it's just things. So I had a months-long plan from February until May, because I set a deadline of May because of my birthday, of just cleaning my house to get a better study environment. Because otherwise, at the point I was at, I still had boxes in this room from when I was in university, and I had to be on my computer in the living room, which means I had to suffer any other noise that was happening, so it made listening just impossible. So I just did that, but the house was so messy that I had to move so many things, blah blah blah. And I think that step is really good, because actually if someone runs straight into AJATT after being excited about it, I think they're just going to burn out. Not because it's too much work, but they realise the commitment that they've made. This room, I painted myself. The wall used to be yellow. I painted it purple. I did that myself. I had to buy all this stuff. This chair is new, this desk is new. Bed isn't. Bed I've had since I was 7. But I still fit in it. It has good storage, so I didn't get rid of it. I did, however, had to move it as I painted this room. This step is telling how real it is, obviously, because it's just like, you've given stuff. I didn't do all the selling that maybe Kat's mentioned, but I'm trying to sell my English translated Chinese comics, but I haven't really done much on that. I would like the money, though. I'm going to stop this video here, and then when I start it up again, I'll get on to what happens when I started AJATT. So starting AJATT itself, I had guilt vocab hangovers compared to other AJATTers, or the ideal. I felt better when I know that people did Tai Kim, but when I just had like a couple hundred words in my head that I didn't really have a Japanese interpretation for, like from a Japanese perspective, I just felt really bad. It felt like I must have had it easier at the beginning than other people. And just feels unfair. However, I am somewhat grateful for the knowledge of conjugations, etc., of just loving them. Small facts like when different readings are likely used, but ultimately you don't need them. You'll figure those out. I mean, conjugations will be fine to learn. They're probably in Tai Kim anyway. Conjugations for the te form are probably the most long-standing, I think. At this point, I'll describe my average day in AJATT, and it's pretty much wake up at 8 a.m. You might think that's a bit too late, but you know, you want to get good sleep. And generally get my breakfast, sit down in my room, eat my breakfast, then do my revision of my writing for all my kanji, and then my sentence cards. Usually there's about 80, then 100. On a good day, I usually finish this before 12. Actually, I've found if I focus really well and don't have any distractions, other than just like passive noise, I can actually finish them quite faster. So usually it's like, if I finish before 12, it's a good day. So I usually finish my revision studying at lunch. And sometimes if I'm having a bad day, like brain's just slower or I didn't have good sleep, sometimes I do half of that task before lunch and then half after lunch. On bad days, they're straight up, it's taken me since 5 p.m. because it's just doing awkwardly with other things badly, not like focusing properly, being tired. Like lunch for maybe like 40 minutes, getting in the way, etc. But like 12 and then have lunch and then get straight into the day, and that means until whatever point that is, usually about 1ish, until when I sleep, which at a good point will probably be like 10. That is the active immersion time. Realistically, it actually stops usually around 7 or something, because dinner just interrupts time before it and after it. So time after dinner is usually the time where I take the collected sentences I have for that day and input them. And sometimes I've ruined my sleep because it took too long. And you just shouldn't do this. If you sleep time, go to bed. Just go to bed. It's a weird way to describe it, because early on, when I wasn't reading any books, for an example, I was just like watching like Knights of Sidonia on Netflix, and I was like, that's my work. That was my work for the day. Watch that, maybe more than once. I don't generally watch things more than once actively, but like watch that. And like I had a bit of a talk with my friend. I usually don't actually message my friends. I have quite little contact. One of the things that drove me insane that I forgot to mention is that, of course, after being done with university for 4 years, I'm back in my normal town, which doesn't really have any people my age because it has no university facilities really. So I had no one to hang around with really. I have some local friends, so it's unfair to say that kind of thing, but like I've lost the people I was interacting at that point. But sometimes friends message me, and I encourage this because I won't go out my way to message friends very often in AJATT, because naturally you just lose the day to a single conversation. It's really surprising how easily that happens. But a friend messaged me. I was just like, I imagine if traditional learners or even like some strict teachers saw that I was calling this work, they'd probably just come up and be like, try and to stop and be like, why aren't you studying a textbook? Like, that's how it really feels. It feels like going, well, this is my work and I know it's work. Whereas other people would probably just feel like it's bullshit. Just like, well, I'm listening to it and I'm waiting for words that like I've repeated in my consciousness that I've heard in other things. Like the early time, Matt's described it a few times about how it really, about the simple chart for it of how things build up. But like the easy way to learn simple words, first of all, it's like you watch one series, you watch another series, and the same thing shows up, and you'll notice, like your brain will force you to notice, it could be the only thing in common at that point. Everything else will be just noise. And like the way you know a word is normal is if like I watched Nice Estonia and then went to Demi-Human, I'm going to say the English title, and it's like, there's entirely different settings, and they end up using the same word, and I'm like, that's got to be it. Sorry, that's got to be a normal word, because both weird settings used it. Like, that sort of thing. And you can really pick up the easiest things, like, without any problem. Because they're all things like leave it to me, like, be careful, etc, etc. Like, I'm fine, everything's fine, are you okay? Dead. Like, all those things are actually really easy to pick up. I picked up the word for surprise. Just like surprise were the words that forever I didn't have a card for, because I just knew what it was, and it matched the exact kanji that I thought it was from having an English word associated with kanji from RTK. As soon as I found it when reading, I was just like, that must be the word. I mean, it's got the reading on it, and that's kanji. Like, oh, it matches. Ding. Like, I didn't need more than that, which is surprising. But it just shocks people, because people think immersion is just like, oh, it's magic. It's just like, you'll get it in your head, and you're just like, no. I mean, as an adult learner, there's consciousness involved, but like, it's kind of like consciousness noticing subconsciousness rather than just consciousness. So really what you do is take conscious attention, so subconscious will pick it up, and then later they'll be like, oh, by the way, this word, and put a ding in your ear compared to all the noise, you'd be like, why did I pick up that word? How many other times have I heard that word? You just won't know. And then you just start not being able to not hear it, and it's great. But initially listening to Japanese all the time was hard. People usually say about a month is like tiring, because you've got to get used to just... a couple times early on, when I was rewatching a show I'd already watched with subtitles from before, not when I was doing AJATT, I was watching Gundam Build Fighters Raw because I love Build Fighters. And, like, I fell asleep. I don't know if like, bad sleep affected me, but, like, I'm dipping in and out. Like, there's definitely amount of mental work. Like, you've ever had that tiring thing where you look at, like, G-Show's great, G-Show.org, great radical section, which is how I use to find a kanji if I don't already know it, because I can build it up from radicals and get it. If you look at that and feel tired, it's because you have, like, no grasp of kanji. They're just random symbols, so you have nothing to equate with them. It's kind of like that feeling, because you have nothing to equate with the noise, but it's the audio version, so you just get tired from trying to pay attention. But you get past it. The biggest problem was that, like, I felt like, even when I got to the reading section, like 3 months later, not reading section, but section of like, oh, I can read now, I can take sense mining, like, I started having more snacks between meals, like, not terrible snacks, it's like toast and things. It's just like, I'm out of energy. I need more energy. All I'm doing is sitting down, hearing and reading things, and that is energy. Because my mind isn't used to it. And it just gets easier all the time, though. Because you'll just feel like how much it's easier after time. When you first have to learn words, you're physically matching meaning in your head every time you hear them. But after you've done that for a certain amount of time, you don't need to anymore. Because you just hear the word and then it just goes, boom, meaning. And that is one of the most important things about the difference between, like, knowledge and ability. Because no amount of knowledge of a word is just going to go, boom, in your head, perfectly hear it every time. And it might make you be able to pick it out when you hear it more, but you'll still probably have that step of going, what is that again? Ah, right, yeah. And that'll be harder, because if you're watching something with a lot of words that sound really fast, it'll be harder to retrack that last sentence and do it. And so at that point, like, you feel like you really need to have things be smooth before you can even take that. But I've only had that problem recently, and I'll explain that when the kind of things that I'm doing right now. But early on, it was a bit of an emotional roller coaster. There were totally points where I would say that I wouldn't recommend this experience-wise, but I think it's just that anything isn't perfectly easy. I mean, it's not that it's easy, but, like, it's grinding. There are times where I was just upset. And I've been an anxious person anyway. I've in the past suffered from anxiety attacks. Actually, AJATT fixed that quite easily for me, because I can't think about a lot of things when I'm doing AJATT. It's just like, I've got to make progress today. Got anything else to do. People have managed to become comfortable doing AJATT without any feel of rushing towards their goal, or are completely fine with taking years of their life of heavier commitments. I can't say that. People who right now are the kind of people on Map vs Japan's Discord who are just like, I'm fine with doing this. Like, it may take me ages to do RTK. It doesn't matter. I'm settling in for the ride. Those people might be able to be saints compared to me. Because if I wasn't doing this full time, I might have gone crazy. Because one of the things you can imagine is, if you're doing something, making it all your time, it is indeed important. Like, I know why people find Immersion hard. No one understands more than AJATTers. You can't really complain to them. If you're doing something all the time, you really don't want to feel that you suck at it. But you're going to suck for a while. And the less time you manage to put in it over time, the longer you're going to suck for, while it being your only pastime, you're giving up other things just to do it. Like, giving up social things is totally a normal thing. I don't mean, like, destroy your friends, but I mean a lot of people have found that their friends just aren't very good people when approached this. Like, sorry, I can't go drinking. You suck. I hate you. Whereas, like, I don't have many friends that I interact with, but to be honest, my friends are just lovely people. I don't deserve them. They're weirdly supportive of me. But those other people, they're great. Whereas I, unfortunately, am fitting it in the original time frame of AJATT, which is 18 months, which where I have a few really terrible habits, and this is because I have a limited income. I don't really have an income. I have savings because all my grandparents have unfortunately passed away. And that's basically my money. I have leftover money plus that. Savings. This is important to me. I'm using actual things in my hands. So fitting with the time is hard because I've reached a point where I'm like, I could force it, I mean, I could technically force the 10,000 sentences in that time, but that wouldn't necessarily be it. Like, I was totally fine with the idea that, like, okay, maybe I'm not very talkative by the time I get to Japan, but that's fine. I can still put in time to get better, and it'll become easier to use the things in Japan once I have low-level fluency, so that being in the country will actually be more helpful to some extent when I'm not busy. And I could still probably fit in time learn pitch accent after I learned midway that that was a sort of problem that I would have to really care about if I cared about being understood like that. And as you can imagine, my goal was indeed to be able to fit alongside Japanese people as much as possible and have no difference. I totally fantasized about being able to just have a Skype call, like do a weird sort of prank where you meet people on Skype and like they don't even know that I'm not Japanese, and that'll be a great time. But we'll get on to that, like that sort of sobby but probably sensible goal in terms of living in the country when I go through more, because I still have more to say. But I'd like to point out that lots of people who endeavour to do this don't even finish RTK. That is enough of a hurdle. It's not this hard, it's just taken a while. I mean, it's a few months, but while you're doing that, you just... that step at least, it's a lot of pressure, I would think, because you're just staring at things and just listening the whole time, trying to pay attention to massive amounts of noise. And you'll get there, you will totally get there, but it is quite a thing to deal with. So the pressure is big. You feel the weight of how long the goal itself will take, and I've already seen, in my own experience, some pretty bad examples of people super rage quitting in around a month. Like to the point where like they were super happy about AJATT when they started, and when they stopped they just shouted, calling it a scam and everything. I was like, I mean, I don't understand tons of things perfect. You'd be surprised at comics that I read that like where there be holes in it, but like self-help books is a weird sort of brag because it's not very descriptive or anything. Like I do read light novels now, but it's the point that I've done that and been comfortable from it and read it as a book. Kanji helps so much because even if I don't know the full words, if I can see a picture, it's still some information. If I know the general thing that kanji is used for, if I don't know the word, I can still be like, oh, I guess that means that, even if I can't understand the full sentence. So if it's more one thing I don't understand, doesn't mean I can't understand the book. It's actually surprisingly easy. I'm going to get on to things I did, starting with things I used. One thing, I know I've been doing this, looking over here. It doesn't look so bad on camera, but I guess it looks really unnatural. I'm looking over to my second monitor. If you do this, I recommend a second monitor. Things are quite cluttered if you're just looking at, here's a picture of the thing I managed to get from my immersion. Here's my window for doing Anki. Blah, blah, blah. I got a second monitor from the start without second thinking. I was like, I need this, and I was totally right. Get a second monitor. Next thing to use is most common anime torrents. I mean, people might get angry at this, but like that's how most people consume anime anyway, and that's good because you could then cut it up into audio to put on things, so you can always be listening. You should only watch it raw, never use English subtitles. That will only drive you back. Like, don't try and use them to understand words that you're hearing, because they're always used to fit what would make the English most useful, well, most useful and natural. Whereas you need to know what the Japanese actually says, not just an English interpretation of it, and then just guess. Most people use kitsuneko.net, which I'll link everything in the description, don't worry about it. I mean, you already know, it's right there. Kitsuneko for subs, it's a website. I've just posted a lot of, in this case, Japanese subtitles for just anime. I do have one big warning though. Some things are bullshit. Some of the folders don't actually have many things in them. Some have only a few episodes. And subfiles titled with just numbers for titles, not the series name, just the number of the episode in that series folder, are usually shit. And I say this in the actually wrong. They tend to be riddled with typos and incorrectly applied kanji. And I've even done a Netflix comparison of Japanese Netflix to demonstrate this by putting Japanese Netflix subtitles just straight up on the screen. I was just like, this is just wrong. And sometimes I've seen how it's like wrong from hearing a look at it. It's like, that's grammatically like low level wrong. I was just like, I've dropped shows because the only available subtitles are just wrong. So what you do is just listen to it, and if you hear something, put up subtitles. Sometimes people seem to do work where they time the subtitles themselves to the video, or find ones that are timed to certain groups' videos, and they just turn it off and on with a button in their preferred media player. I don't really find the need to do this, so all I ever do is just search the word in the thing. But this probably doesn't apply very well to, like, I mean, I don't really see the problem. I probably think it doesn't apply well to kanji, but if you type the sound of a word, you get the reading. That's how Japanese typing works, which I'm very used to it now. I don't know if you are. For getting Japanese definitions, I usually refer immediately to a program called Calibri, which is just a way to stock text files, kind of, for dictionaries, I think specifically, but use things called Epwing files of Japanese dictionaries that it can search through simultaneously to make it easy to compare and copy definitions. I usually, when I put them into my card, I usually highlight their contents with different colours if it's a word with multiple definitions, and I'm making it clear to myself which ones I already have a card for, etc., etc. This sounds complicated, but this is all thanks to Matt vs. Japan. He has a video on setting this up. It's not hard at all. I haven't even bothered adding any Epwing files that are available on, like, the spreadsheet list of great resources that is available to people who are on Matt vs. Japan's Discord, which you get on by being a Patreon. I should have mentioned by this point, but you know, you pay $1 a month and still get all these advantages. He has a video setting this up, and I haven't added any more since that. Just ones that he provided like a torrent file of that in that video, and it is probably the thing I consider the most beneficial to have. That is technically an optional thing, I guess, but it's what you need for the monolingual transition. It's so great. It's a priceless resource. It would make tons and tons of difference just having that. In more specific situations, sometimes those dictionaries, there are certain dictionaries that have pitch accent, which is a thing I'm looking out for, so they have numbers on them to display the pitch. I've not actually studied pitch accent yet. I'll explain a bit in a minute about what I plan to do in the future, etc., etc. But sometimes there are words that just those dictionaries don't have a thing for, and so for those situations, they usually like add verbal uses of onomatopoeias, those sort of things. I use Weblio, which is an internet dictionary that does compile a few dictionaries, but the thing is that the one that is done by itself has pitch accents, and so sometimes the pitch accents for those words that otherwise don't in those dictionaries. So that's useful. Weblio. I have subs to SRS, which I don't actually use it for the great things you could use it for, like putting audio in your things, because I'll explain in a minute. But I use subs to SRS to rip audio from things. You just put files in them. I think it was Matt first, like no, it was Brit first Japan that video. I can't remember. But you just put the videos in there, and you can use a tool that just extract audio, and you rip out audio, and you can cut it up into bits. So you just cut it up into 1 minute 30 seconds, and it's not always perfect because on the dynamism of opening and endings where they place them, you sometimes do a bit more editing. But I use it to cut out openings and endings, which you might immediately hate just on instinct. But like, if you're going to list something passively, just get rid of the openings and endings. It's not doing you any advantage. You want the contents. And recently, as I've become more specific about the things I do now take notes. The last few weeks I've started taking notes when I've started doing a bit more of a push on these things. Taking notes while watching of just sections I won't need that would be separated in those 1 minute 30 chunks, so I can easily take them out when I have them set up, and then just put them into something.
in my case, I bought a smartphone for this. It's a OnePlus. This is a cover. I'm not going to open it because I have notifications. But before this, did not have a smartphone. That's how backwards I am. I had the same phone I got from my dad when I was 11 until now, and that was an old phone when I got it. So I got a smartphone specifically for this because of more storage and wider things. My storage is actually like 80 gigs pretty easily. I only pay like 20 quid a month for this, so it was great. Most people recommend a dedicated MP3 player, and you don't really need a new one. You can have a tiny one like an iPod Nano. If you're actually moving the audio that you used before, you have tons amount of space on a lot of things anyway. I haven't really moved any audio because sometimes I like to switch it up and go back to things, which is totally a viable thing to do. But yeah, you might do better in a dedicated MP3 player for listening, because then you don't have calls to interrupt you. I generally don't have calls to interrupt me. That's because I'm not a social person. It's not a big problem. I did actually continue to use Crunchyroll and still do now, especially in the beginning, because at that point you don't need to care about having subtitles for them. You just want to get as much in your head as possible. The annoying thing is though that like while you can watch the videos on Crunchyroll without subtitles displaying on them, if you right click and you no subtitles, they will disappear. I have to do this manually for every episode because the only default settings in Crunchyroll only allow you to defaultly set the subtitles to a specific language. So I have to manually do that every episode. Crunchyroll, the app, you can't do this because in that case they're baked right onto the video. And I do find that when the video is fresh, sometimes they're like proliferarily, can't say anything like for the beginning, sometimes the video is really new, it is just the baked on subtitle video and you can't turn the subtitles off, so you might have to wait a bit sometimes. But yes, I am still paying for Crunchyroll. One of the decent tips from doing Amazon Japan is you can physically buy bulk comics, and they are dirt cheap in comparison to here, because after all they are comics, uncoloured, without any dealing with translation. So sometimes individual volumes are as much as £3, which is great. And if you buy them in bulk, the shipping price is applied to the whole set, and that's when you buy a bulk set thing. There are a few unfortunate instances recently that I found where there's a bulk listing, but what they're doing is actually manually putting those things together. So when you put it in your cart, it's not bulk thing, it's each one of the volumes are now in your cart. So you have to keep an eye out for that. It's not useful for what I'm saying, because that's just not having to search for them all. But what I'm here is physical bulk manga. And again, I pronounce a Japanese word in a terrible way. But like physical bulk comics from Amazon. There might be people here who like JoJo, right? I thought I'd give it a shot, and I bought all 24 volumes of Steel Ball Run, JoJo Part 7, for like 70 quid. That means like each one of them is like less than £3, like something like that. Like all of them. It's seriously cheaper than buying any sort of translation. So I just have that, like, it's right here. I've read it all. I read it all quite quickly. I remember reading the last 5 volumes in one day because I just wasn't finding sentences, I was just ramping up the conclusion. Yeah, that's totally the thing you can do. I didn't do it much. A few times at the beginning to get myself excited, I just tried first volume of a bunch of things, put them together, but that doesn't get a bulk thing. But like, I mean, I spent like 100 quid on a single thing. I was just like, oh, and I'll have this and this and this. But apart from that, I just got into using Book Live. I originally knew about eBook Japan and had an account for that for a while, but I think Book Live is just better. It looks better, it's easier, there's always tons of discounts. I mean, the other one does too, but like, this just seems more accessible. And while eBook Japan, you can use the mobile app outside of Japan, and Book Live you can't, there's nothing stopping you from just running Book Live in a browser on your phone and just having it work fine. That's what I've been doing when I've
do it. I originally started just reading it on my computer, and it get a bit awkward because it's kind of big, and you can have a zoom in function, but it just means you can't read enough of the same thing. But reading on my phone is actually pretty nice. Video games you can use naturally, but they just dropped off for me if they weren't text heavy, because it just felt like an inefficient use of time. Doing it, I had like one earphone in for the game the whole time, if it was like a visual novel. Matt's graphed like visual novels later, and I can understand that, but I did things like Virtue's Last Reward almost straight away. I'd already done it in English, so things that were confusing plot-wise weren't that bad for me. And it was pretty good. So just have that in all times and listen to passive consciously if you get into grinding, for example. But pretty much if there isn't any like strong text on screen for the thing you're playing, I can't really recommend it super much. At the beginning it might not matter so much, but I do think you want to focus on mostly on listening things, so you get a lot of listening at the start, and then when you're trying to get things from games, you want lines, you want text. It's just things that want text have just fell off. And also a thing I want to mention that people know, but when I think about it, is visual novels aren't listening practice unless you hide the text box with like a text box button. Because what you're doing is it's reading with incidental noise. Unless you're actually only listening to it and not looking at the lines, it's not listening practice. Tons of people end up convincing themselves that like they could totally get it, but the moment you take away the subtitles, they just won't be able to perfectly hear it. And you want to make sure you're always testing and listening for that. So if you're doing visual novels, either at the time when like lines come up, if you're going to consider it listening practice, make sure you don't look at like the text, or you press the button that hides it. Otherwise it's just plain not listening practice, and you have to consider it reading practice. I did in fact get a PS4 for this, but rarely used it. I know I do sound like I'm spinning in money, but make a Japanese PSN account isn't hard with any tutorial. But PSN is really expensive for games. It seems like almost like sometimes more expensive than just the physical game. And I have to use PlayAsia for PSN cards because you just can't use my English debit card. It's the thing I know at this time, but it's the thing I know now because of some advice from Brit vs Japan's articles. You can get Japanese address for things like PSN by using tenso.com, which I will put in the description. It's free as long as you don't actually ship things from it. I learned this for using Audible Japan advice for audiobooks, which is a thing I'm focusing a bit on now, or at least trying to, from an article about Brit vs Japan for doing that. The thing is that Tenso is it's a not go-between. You can use it as a Japanese address for buying things from Japan, then using it to ship them to you as a middleman. That's the word I was looking for, without having to use any other services. But you don't actually have to pay anything unless you're dealing with their shipping rates from the thing. So if you just set up an account, you can just get like an address in their warehouse, and that's just a straight up Japanese address. Perfectly valid. Steam is a bit more convenient due to the screenshot function. If you can get a game on Steam in Japanese, it's pretty good. But if you're awkward the amount that you can't, like things like Dragon Ball Z games, they don't have Japanese, even though they're naturally released in Japanese, they don't have Japanese audio options quite a lot on Steam for some reason. And for some reason, since the like the PS1 Final Fantasy games, since they are based off of the mobile thing, I mean, even though it's a Japanese release of the mobile port, for some reason you can't play them Japanese. You can play 10 onwards in Japanese options, but you can't play those with Japanese, which really sucks. I want to play 9 so bad. But one of the most screenshot function is, even if you're going to be a crazy man, click it all the way through cutscenes just to make sure you get everything. Like, you don't have to deal with it until like you close the thing and it'll be like, you want to open your screenshot folder? Like, yes. Sometimes you just have it open and do that. I got into a habit that's just what I do now, which isn't great time-wise. I've seen certain advice for just like, don't save sentences. But I make so many typos that I discovered the next day, and indeed in the start, sometimes the next month in the card I made. So I actually save cards in a folder called temp
paint, because I put them into paint and like highlight the area that I'm interested in sometimes. If it's a thing with a lot of text, and I just have a screenshot of it, and then save it with the date and the number of the image that is of that day, etc. And then after it, write the word that I'm looking for. Windows Explorer for things like that just sometimes just gets a bit uppity and just doesn't care about the word that you're looking for, even though it's totally there. So sometimes I do things like tutorials about cleaning out my indexes just to make it notice them again, and sometimes it didn't work, but I just do generally do that now. Get things at the end of the day and I save them, whether they're a card that I made or not. If I think it's just crap, then I'll just get rid of it, but otherwise I'll save it for later if it's a card that like has multiple words that I want to know in that sentence, because I know as soon as I swing one I want the other. That sort of thing. The kind of... You've ever seen Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and that scene where Edward is being pulled out of the gate of truth and it's just points. It's like, wait. I'll do it better for you on the camera. Wait. And like, that's what you'll be doing every time you come across a sentence where the only words you know are multiple words that you know you want to know. And then you'll be like me and you'll save it for later. And then you swing one, you get both, and you go boom! Made two new sentences. Or it's probably better to space this by a day or something, but I usually end up just putting them like the same day, because one's a test for one, the one's a test for the other one. I have the Android Anki app for days when my computer broke. I had it installed all the time. It's free on Android, so just have it, because if your computer breaks, just take your thing from Anki Web and just continue being able to revise. You don't have to go crazy. luckily there. Although if you're going to get a bit antsy about your deck, which you are, because it's going to mean a lot to you after this time, you don't want to lose that stuff. Anki always keeps like 30 back, like the last 30 times you opened it as a backup. I, being crazy, take every day's new backups and back them up in 3 different places. My phone, a memory stick that I have, and Dropbox, but that's run out of memory because I have never removed old backups. So they're all just still in there, so technically Dropbox isn't actually backing those up. I might start doing it on my external drive, since I got an external drive now. Excuse me. I got an external drive even after I had a 2 GB extra drive for this. No, 2 TB extra drive. The external drive is 2 TB. That's because of torrents. They could be huge, and I don't have a choice to pick, as I'll get into the despair part. But I have every backup since the start, basically no reason. Yeah, so I read light novels now, mostly trash. There's a lot of experiences that you kind of have in this. I mean, pretty straightforward, but a lot of people advanced in this like to say things like this, like really just getting good at anything and doing the work that requires that can really help form you as a more capable person, etc., etc. A lot of people in doing this, especially they say to Matt vs. Japan, they say things like, look, can you give me more motivation? AJATT, the blog, has tons of great pages for motivation, but I never went back to read it afterwards. When I started AJATT, I was just like, no, I don't need this. I don't need any more motivation. I mean, sometimes I have bad motivation, but like, I don't really need anything. That's like, here's the problems that you have with motivation when you're doing it though. You feel lost upon finishing something. Like, you feel good, oh, I finished something. And then you're just like, oh, I've got to find something new. I've got to find something new. What is my next thing? It's so hard to find those new things. Sometimes I had to spend like consecutive days reading previews, just comics, before I find the next thing to get into. And those days feel like nothing, because taking sentences from those previews you don't feel like really good or anything. It's just like multiple days of reading nothing but previews of comics, going, oh, am I going to find anything I like ever again? And like, or like getting into something and then the vocabulary suddenly becomes inaccessible in those parts to you because it's luck ultimately. Like, I've had bad times saved to me by something as simple as
oh man, today Book Live started recommending me a bunch of shitty 4-panel comics about weird relationships to have with your little sister. And I was just like, man, these are so trash, they're great. And then that saved me. And like a recent thing would be like discovering that DL Site just has a lot of demos for Eroge. And like, that'll save me. That's like a month's find of a thing that'll save me. I'll be doing those because the demos go really far, and they actually, depending on the thing you play, just whatever it is, like not even anything obvious, but when you play it, you're like, man, the difference in just like depth of descriptions and what's expected of you in each one of these can actually change, like vary quite a bit. So they're also quite good at multiple different levels. And if you think you can't get words from porn, I will tell you right now that despite how many people find it so hard to interact with Immersion, etc., someone could get good at just AJATT straight from like, if they read nothing but porn, they would still get somewhere. Like, if you read nothing but fan-made porn of things, they would still get somewhere. There's way more like typos, but they're still gonna get somewhere, and you can tell there's typos. One of the things trying to deal with mostly with motivation is luck, or why I learnt nothing from My Hero Academia months later. My Hero Academia is one of the first things that I started listening passively, and I got some things from it that were good, and etc., but there's some things I just never got from it. There were so many things that I just didn't understand, and when I came back to it months later to re-listen, I just was like, man, I still can't get any more from this. It's just luck. So it's like, you know what, maybe I'm just not hearing it, and I'll start reading like volumes of the comic. I then had a day where I spent 4 hours reading the first volume because I like My Hero Academia. It's great. One of the great. I recommend things like that at the beginning because anything that you can like cry emotionally and get behind, it's gonna like get you like, I can feel this. I don't need to have the English subtitles to tell me like that I feel something from doing this. But like, I just didn't get anything new. I spent 4 hours reading the first volume and I didn't get anything. It's just luck. I just like, there's a lot of curse from a lot of things like that where it's like they use such casual language sometimes that sometimes the thing will only be said once and you'll never see it again in the same volume. Like and I'll be like, well, I get that. That'd be a normal everyday thing, but it means like nothing to go on, etc., and like things like that sometimes cut into narration, which is an entirely different way of speaking with more complicated things to it. One of the things you'll hate about doing this for a long time is watching something and be like, oh, I understand this, leave it to me, be careful, I'll do this, what are we doing for the culture festival? And then at the end of an episode, the main character will break into an in his head monologue of, and so it was that we learned the greatest thing of the greatest thing, and I blah 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 on the dawn of the blank. And it's just, that was a jump. And the thing is, you can't just make those same jumps to the same thing. A lot of people, when asking about advice early on, weirdly say things like, how much of a thing should I learn before I move on to the next one? It's like, it won't work like that. It'll just be whatever shows up that you can use, that you feel like taking. Because you're not going to get all of everything from something the first time, especially early on. But it's just, I didn't get anything going back. I was just like, no, it was just, I just probably not going to get anything from My Hero Academia at this point. It's just luck. Like, even when I went back months later, just like, words for me just don't slide in because I just don't have the right words. That's just how it goes. It doesn't matter that it's a kid's thing. It's just, if you don't have the right words, you don't have the right words. I have read more complicated things, but it's just like, no, can't do that. So when people go to people like Matt Fish Japan, influential people, and want help for motivation, it's like, I just don't do motivation, because what he says all the time is like, I didn't have a motivation problem. I'm just like, man, you're powerful. But he recommends like meditation, so at least understands stress, but naturally go to AJATT's website itself for motivation. But if you want motivation from me, I can give you motivation. Well, more advice that I think might help you. I'm of course not perfect, but I have about 3 pieces of advice to give you. One is forward is forward. You will only get anywhere by going forward. If you stop, there can be no progress. If you don't like where you are now, you have to go forward to stop it. Right? Good. Number 2, you are always better than yesterday. You may have worse days than yesterday, you may have way less fun than yesterday, you may make no progress in comparison to yesterday, you may make tons of mistakes, or like forget things, or you just come across nothing but dead ends in the things that you were looking into. But I guarantee you, if you're doing this consistently, you will never be worse than yesterday. And that means every time you manage to have fun, then you've won. Because you've proven that you can have fun. The only problem is finding that place you can have fun in, which is indeed a problem. But, you know, take that to heart. And number 3 is, it's actually something I learned during Wanikani. Learning things is actually pretty mundane. There's no boom time. You can only really compare things afterwards. That's why sometimes keeping a diary will be helpful, because you look back, you're like, man, I found that hard, and don't find it hard anymore. One of the things you'll find that happens so much is you'll hate a phrase, and that's why you'll start noticing it more, and that's why you'll conquer it. So many times later on, it's like, I hate this. I hate seeing this all the time. I can't deal with it. And then you find a sentence where you can get it, just done, destroyed forever. Thank you. And that'll feel good. That stress is actually what makes that feel good. But number 3, because of this mundanity of like, I know things, I don't know I know things. Like, you're a person that natively speaks English, probably, if you're watching this video. If someone asks you how many words you know in Japanese, you'd be like, oh, I know this and that, I know this number. If like someone asks you how many words you know in English, you'd be like, red, dog, the, house. Because you don't know how many words you know. And ultimately, when you get to a decent number, you just don't know. When they come up, and you're just like, oh yeah, I know this. And that's how it'll be. Until the point where you're just like, oh, I'm not coming across things that... Like, there are a decent amount of things, like some things. And most of this one is really simple, admittedly. But it's just like, I'm annoyed because there's not enough things I don't know. It's where I am at with some things. But it's all the more annoying when I switch to something that's slightly more technical, and then it's just like, oh, here's a bunch of bullshit words. So I can't understand all this. Like specific words that already exist in that universe, etc., etc. But here's the core of mundanity. Advice number 3. Everything you know is obvious. Everything you don't know is impossible. But everything in between is inevitable. All you have to do is put in the time, and it will show up for you, and that's all you have to do. The problem with all the stress is that you never know when time's going to reward you. I understand so much. But it still goes towards, it's not that everything's hard, it's that something's hard now. It doesn't mean it's going to be hard later. You find something, you're like, oh, I don't understand this now, and you find another thing later, it's just like, well, it's the easiest thing in the world. And that's all it is. This experience is just making it through those bits. As for how it's affected me and my sort of new beliefs, I mentioned the porn thing, which is probably a bit open for some people, but like, I fully believe now that just a kid who understands the basics of AJATT, knows how to use an SRS properly, knows how, a kid who understands the basics of AJATT knows how to use an SRS properly, and unreasonably loves like Naruto, will know more Japanese in their summer break than someone reading textbooks. They may know less advanced grammar, but they will understand way more, because they'll see how things actually work. And like, your human mind is like, a Japanese child is fluent and will talk circles around all learners, no matter how much grammar and vocabulary they know. I know way more words than a 4-year-old Japanese child. A 4-year-old Japanese child could probably still get on better in Japanese society than me, though. Because they could just easily say anything they want. It's amazing. Now I'd like to get into something I've been hinting this entire time. I'll make another cut here. Next time, things I fucked up. Welcome to Things I Fucked Up, AJATT. Learn from me. Learn from all the people that come before you so they can make the mistakes so you don't have to. So, one of the things I really screwed up now is something that's talked about a bit more. It's the balance between reading and listening. I had a few problems with listening right at the beginning because, for one thing, well, I started AJATT a month after the widest used anime torrent site decided to stop. The things I could download became heavily limited. It's not that I didn't manage it, it's just like squeeze things more and more. And when I got to the stage where I accepted reading, I just did it straight up. I spent like a whole day reading half a volume of Death Note over and over. I rampaged through tons of comics, etc., etc. You're supposed to change audio like a week. I was changing it like 1 or 2 weeks, and outside the occasional weekly shows and whatever I was doing on YouTube, not much active listening actually. I mean, I didn't consider it too bad at the time, but I was just like, this is what I can get reasonably, I think. And I was just like going, well, I want to make progress, and like my train of thought, it's probably because I suffer from things like ADHD and things, but it's so hard for me to start things. But once I start things, the worst thing for my motivation to go on is to stop them. Sometimes I spent a day reading like I got to the point where my reading ability was, for most comics, I could read 3 volumes in a day, and that would be what I did in the day. I had passive listening, and I did check the occasional weekly show, which at most meant like an hour of active listening. Like an hour or 2 hours of active listening a day, compared to reading that was ridiculously small. And, you know, and like I got up in the morning, it's like, what am I going to do today? It's like, I have to read more volumes of that thing. I have to make myself do it, otherwise I'll end up doing nothing. And that's just how I push myself. Just right out of the gate, it's just, this is just bad. There's reasons why, let's see, if I should have written down why things are bad and why it was... Sorry. I'll give you the real reason why this is bad. Actually, it's I heard lots of stories from Matt vs. Japan, like quite a while, for like people. You have to worry about like reading too far ahead of your listening because you get a terrible accent. Okay, this is the concern that I now have that is very real to me, and you'll understand once I present this. And it is that when I interpreted that at the time as those people like didn't get enough listening so that they know how to pronounce all their words or heard them enough, and then they got fluent and they didn't try hard enough to fix it, etc., etc. Because once you're fluent, you just want to spew things sometimes, maybe. I didn't know how many people of these were like super hardcore AJATTers, just did something that was bad. But the problem is it goes way deeper than that, and I didn't realise that at the time. And now, recently, Matt will straight up tell people, and I'll give you a kind of... I'll give you straight up from the horse's mouth to avoid anything else. It's a response to someone's question about this, straight from what Matt said as his response on his Discord. If you read a lot before you have developed your listening skills, you are training your brain to have extremely powerful predictive abilities based on context, collocations, and knowledge of words which are commonly used. This ability compensates for the lack of ability to clearly hear the differences between all the individual vowels, consonants, and changes in pitch, which hinders that ability from truly ever developing. If your brain gets away with never training itself to hear all of the nuance
on the level of vowels, consonants, and change in pitch, then of course you aren't going to become able to replicate that yourself when speaking. Later on, no matter how much you go back and listen, this is what starts to happen. First, as your reading ability develops ahead of your listening ability, you make up how the language sounds in your head as you sub-vocalize what you read. The sound system of your interlanguage becomes partially based on your imagination. Once this solidifies, even if you go back and do large amounts of listening, what happens is your brain just learns to convert real Japanese into your interlanguage, instead of your interlanguage being molded by the native input. No matter how you think about it, the longer you wait to read, the better results you are likely to be. Better results are likely to be when it comes to accent. But it also means slower progress, so you have to think about to what extent is the trade-off worth it. I think that as long as you do only listening during the RTK phase, and after that actively listen more than you read, then you'll most likely be able to gain 80% of the benefits of not reading at all until spoken fluency, which is not really the goal of AJATT, but to be fair, that is the gold standard. And back to the thing. So one realistic strategy is to engage with text, with mining and repping, and almost go all listening outside of that. That way you can still easily mine sentences, utilize the SRS, and learn word meanings in Japanese while having your accent be mostly safe. If having as close to native accent isn't a priority for you, then you can read from the beginning and it will help you grow your vocabulary very quickly. So naturally the problems I had was I misinterpreted this, and I'm pretty sure I'm past the threshold for this now. So there may be nothing I can do to fix this, which sucks because I am someone that wants to be able to live among my target audience and be indistinguishable. But that might not be possible now. My attitude of maybe fixing this later by making do with what I had is basically a very similar, I think is a very similar problem, like with what traditional learners do, thinking there's no point in watching something they don't know all the words to. Because it's like, they'll get to it later, sort of thing. Like, my problem is I had lack of resources. Even if I show you now, like, the amount of things I end up putting on passive is like, probably about 30 series by this point, which isn't one a week. And to be fair, some of those things, like, occasional thing, like, that varies from 12 episode series, 24 episode series to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, right? And Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, I listened for like 3 weeks, it's 64 episodes. And then there's times when I've gone back and listened to that and I've totally got more things and it's helped. So I've been repeating things more. But the things that passive audio, while I had a lot of opportunities to listen to it, and I've literally been listening to it 24/7, it's not anywhere near active listening. And I know this, but I just didn't think too much about it. It's naturally the best thing to do. The reason why I got super hard into this question and answer thing Matt did is because he ended up when he was giving some advice, he said like, well, it shouldn't have any problem like if you at least listen as much as you read, but that's basically the minimum recommended. Having your reading time match your watching, like your listening time, and I've just that's just destroyed from my perspective. When I used to start reading things, I could tell like it had an image, like a voice in my head. That's really gone now, and I don't think that's probably not the same. There might be some placebo effects, but like, because actually I don't know a lot of the words that I hear in novels that I only moved on to like 2 months ago. And when my computer broke at the beginning of June this year, I had 2.5 weeks before it came back. Not because it was a hard thing to fix, just because they were busy. Where all I could really do was just watch things on YouTube on my phone and read. Just 2.5 weeks of that. And the YouTube video was just like product reviews by your favorite people. And I had a lack of resources, for one thing. But ultimately, I think I was just too stingy of wanting to be efficient, of only taking the time to really watch things that had subtitles available. That was hard. Like, give me an example of, like, even the difficulty like it's not entirely recovered. Sometimes it's just hard. Like,
it took me over a week to download Ava. A week for Ava.
And I watched it all in one day. Sometimes looking over a video game, then never again. And just I didn't find it interesting enough. Some bits seemed too much of a bother to edit to make it viable for passive, so I didn't even make it passive. So there's a decent number of series that I just don't even turn to passive. But I've watched a decent number of things. It's just it's not comparable to the amount of time I spent reading. Things that have subtitles available, I didn't think to go out of my way to acquire them because I consider it inefficient, and even though I need to cover as much of a wide range as possible in my experience, you want to have as wide as a range of experience of a language as you can in both listening and reading. You know, mainly listening. But even when I was just watching a weekly show, which I couldn't have subtitles for unless it was a kid's show or something, I hated finding good sentences and not being able to take them, and then finding sentences later and things I could take that would require the word that I would learn from that sentence that I was unable to get. I hated having that feeling. Sometimes I avoided that sort of thing, and that's just terrible. I should have watched more things and made more time to watch things, even if I couldn't take anything from them. Since the new resources people put, which most likely you can just see if you watch Matt vs. Japan's video, I probably don't need to bother link them, you probably understand it better from that. People newfound resources to just watch Japanese Netflix pretty easily, just with no risk really. But you just do that, and it opened a bunch of things. But even then, I didn't super do it. Like, I tried watching Magical Index the first time a while ago, and I just couldn't pay attention enough because it just wasn't interesting enough to me. And but now that I can make those things passive, it's a bit more of a push to grind through them, because of a newfound dependence on FlixGrab, and even today I got the program working again to be able to download the image files that are Japanese subtitles on Netflix into text files, because it kept jumping in and out for me for how much it worked. So mostly I had to make awkward pictures in Paint of copy and pasting multiple shots, and considering every time Netflix goes backwards it wants to reload everything, it's pretty shit. But you know, for those, just go to Matt vs. Japan's channel, it'd be great. Trouble is, the audio moved from a primary source from necessary practice for mostly itself without me realising, so I didn't adapt at the time. Around the time I started light novels, even though I still read mostly in the day. And I have problems around organising things, as I said, because it feels like homework while I'm doing what I want. The last few weeks I've been trying to rectify this, even though I have no way of knowing how much I can rectify. It's ultimately better to have a certain amount of listening, but like I read like 3 comics in one day. This is what made me push to light novels, because I just wasn't getting enough words out of what I was reading, and it's cost me too much a day, whereas it took me like 3 days to read one light novel. But now if I make most of the day listening, because I kind of want to, and I end up doing like reading at the end at like 5 or 6 p.m. and then awkwardly interrupted by like dinner and stuff, even that doesn't feel like I'm taking in enough. Like, I watched all of Toradora in like 2 days, and I know like 90% of the words, like can't turn that into passive, and I've still got to watch enough in this week to like of a full show before I put it into passive audio to make it worth it. Even if I'm hitting the lowest possible limit of like just try, if I get enough to make it a passive, that's something. Well, it's not the gold standard, but it's like if I don't manage to change my passive audio like regularly, it's just bad. There's some things I started that I just quit, like Nisekoi, because I just did most of it and I was just like, no, I'm not gonna get anything out of this. I'm gonna end it and then not turn to passive because I know I won't get anything out of it. But then there's just like other things. It's just like too technical language. Like, I'm in a fantasy world, I'm going to talk about a bunch of things. I'm in a military world, I'm going to talk about ranks and military words the entire time. And it's just turned to normal things, nothing. The gap between anime and like light novels for me
it's not a great gap of knowledge, but for listening, I can't cover it. There aren't enough light novel audiobooks, so I have to move straight into novel audiobooks, which are things I'm not even comfortable reading. I asked, like, Matt what to do when I came across this, when I realised the problem I had of how to help, and it was just things like, I asked him what his downloading habits were, or like what he did back in the day when he obviously had less resources, because it's often mentioned a lot of time. But when he replied to me, it's like, back in my day, actually pretty much every show I wanted to watch was being seeded on Nia, so within a few months of starting AJATT, I had more shows than I could possibly ever watch. And I was just like, oh. This is nice advice, and I didn't use subs that much, but when I did, I got them from Kitsuneko and spent a lot of time retying them myself. If public trackers aren't doing it for you, try asking around to see if you get invited to Anime Bites, blah blah. I never listened to audiobooks for light novels, as, like you say, they pretty much don't exist. But in reality, a light novel is just a poorly written anime-esque normal novel. So the simple solution is just move on to audiobooks and normal novels. And I have a video on my channel about how to download all of them for free, blah blah blah. I asked follow-up questions about how he balanced material, because he obviously didn't use subs too much. And it's like, I would try to read half the time and watch raw the other half of the time, and mostly mine from what I read. When a word didn't know I would come up in what I was watching and I wanted to learn it, I would just look up and find a random sentence to learn it. And don't judge yourself for what you can and can't produce until you can understand 99% of whatever you are listening to. Speaking ability is based on listening ability, so if you can't effortlessly understand everything you're listening to, you can't expect yourself to be able to speak. It's not really a matter of avoiding reading, it's a matter of doing enough / much more listening. Mass listening will iron out most of your problems. As your ears become sharper, more and more of the knowledge you gain from reading will start to naturally carry over. Now, he said that, but that was actually before the time when he started saying super hard things about how things will wreck your shit, and I'm pretty sure I've reached the threshold of wreck your shit, and I didn't get across exactly how bad I had been. So I'm pretty sure I've wrecked. Like, even if I understand things 90%, I cannot say that I confidently can say those things. Like, I understand them, but I know I can't make those sounds. It becomes this weird, it's this weird barrier of being like, I mean, this might just be normal for all I know, but it's a placebo thing. But it feels like a weird barrier of like, I can't be anything more than an observer to this. I can understand it and be an observer. But before, when things more sharply hit me, I think, because I had to try more harder to focus on them in the early times, before I did much reading at all, it would just, like, I felt like I ran more alongside it. Now I feel like just get it, but I'm probably just, like, it's vague and I'm missing some of the information. And actually you can expect that from just, like, time in general from some of this point, I think. But I just don't know how much bad, because you probably should interpret my level as being bad. But it's not that it's more subtle things. It's not that it's hard for me to understand things. It's that I could probably be understanding things, but I'm just missing details that I would otherwise pick up if I had just spent more time. And I might not ever be able to pick those up now. So I'm just racked. Like, spend most of the day doing thing and reading some of a book. As you can tell from Matt's advice mentioned before subtly, and I'm going to get back to it, naturally I pushed myself for time because I wanted to make the 18-month goal. So I was too conscious of sentences a day, but I managed to get like a decent amount a day of things that I thought were useful for quite a while. There was a few times really early on where it took me time, even inputting them the next day, to input like 50 sentences, and that's way too much for a day, but it wasn't hard at that point because they're very small. But it got me things I wanted. So I was too conscious of making sentence acquisition fit my goal time, too many things a day, and I don't think realistically 18 months is actually possible for the goal without making certain sacrifices like that. Because ultimately the recommended thing is, by this sort of point, not make more than 50 sentences a day, just because it takes up so much time. But actually, for the amount of reading time I get, since now I get less than 3 sentences from every time I finish a series now, at the end of the day, reading is basically my only chance to pick things up. But that just leaves me like, where am I getting listening from? Got to listening from novels, I guess, which I'll get into in a second, of what I've tried so far. I will start putting on passive, but So it's too many sentences a day, and so like I could technically reach the sentence goal and feel good about myself, but it wouldn't of course, knowledge isn't ability, and the time you spend in all that immersion is what really gets you there. The sentences, of course, just turn on the light, because ultimately it's more like an experience bar, not a switch. That's why classical learning's a bit shit, because it's like, well, I know it because I've turned it from off to on, when actually it's more like not at all to really good, with off to on being in this situation wherever you made that sentence card or wherever you hit a limiter that just went, I know what this is, I just haven't got a card for it yet. Like that sort of situation. But now Netflix itself has an extra layer of anxiety. It's just like a whole lot more things, but at the same time, if I can't find something interesting, it's a bit hard. When you have so much choice also, it's so hard to pick something. It's just nothing jumps out at you enough. In recent days, I actually rewatched the second season of God's Blessing on This Wonderful World, because the second season's actually way different in style, and I find it way funnier. And I got a few new things now, but still, it's like 3 sentences for watching it again after all this time. And I've turned it to passive because I didn't turn it to passive before, because it never had subtitles before, so I don't bother to. But now I get subtitles from Netflix. But having Netflix is just this whole level of new anxiety, because it's just, is this just my ceiling? Is this my ceiling for understanding language? I mean, as I get further and further, the more I can just use random YouTube videos, and anything I listen to, it's just be like, I can pick up anything, blah 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 blah, and like I can hear it enough so I can just write the sentence myself, which is not a thing you should trust yourself to do for most times. And you just learn things like that. But I'm too reliant on things. So it's just like Netflix is just my ceiling. It's the resource that I have. If I watch everything on Netflix, if I try really hard and I watch like every single like anime on Netflix, which is a lot of what's most available, then I just have nothing. I have nothing to proceed from. I just feel like, but I need to experience the language, not just anime. And some anime is actually really bad, like people say, but just like I need to experience the language. I've tried a few movies recently, and I was just like, movies are terrible. They have so many montages. There's so little speaking, and the speaking is what I want. I want scenes of silence. Like all throughout my experience with AJATT, I kept my finger on this on the play button of my keyboard that automatically plays my media player, because I just flick this whenever something goes a bit too quiet, there's enough talking. I'm like, what the fuck? So I listen to my passive more than the new thing that I'm listening to all the time. Especially since one of the things I worked through on Netflix that I wanted to was the Monogatari series. And thank God, second season is like 30 episodes long. And it's all scenes of just talking, and even the climax scenes just talking with just the environments animated nicely in the background. So it makes great audio. I'll probably never find a show that's that good on audio again. It's the real problem. So I've tried audiobooks now. And actually, during the audiobooks, when I was tired, I did do the fall asleep thing again. The hard thing is there's no visual data, of course, so you have to focus on the entire time. So the moment you stop focusing, you've just lost it. It's a problem it felt like, 'cause it just progresses, of course. And there's not many gaps in it. So you have to constantly listen the entire time and make sure you're super hard listening. There's not really any drops where you get a break. I've even tried, I tried both like the first few chapters of Harry Potter, which I've never read in English, because I'm a great kid. I tried light novel thing for something really popular, so I can get a few things of it. But it's like, I'm not going to be able to get sentences from these. I'm going to have to read something else. For Harry Potter, at least have text documents. I managed to get torrents of the light novel thing, so it's fine. But I still have to look at it. I can't type the things in a text document, because it's just rips of pictures of the book. Or scans of the digital version, I guess. But it's still the problem of getting myself to pay attention
constantly large amounts of audio data with nothing supporting it. The moment I stop paying close attention, I will lose my place, and even then I will only understand what's happening at certain points, because of course I just won't have, like, I won't just not have visuals, but even characters on a page that would add context just from the general meaning, even if I didn't know the words. So I might experiment more with making the book, making the book itself what I do in my reading time, which is what I initially worried about, because when I worried about going onto audiobook section, I was just like, are you saying I'm only going to be able to read popular books? And this is how I'm going to deal with my audio gap, which is basically like 2 months after I stop light novels, I have to start what's made into an audiobook. That's ridiculous. Like, that jump is too much. I've got to get a hold getting a hold of Harry Potter, that much money problem's easy. But the other thing was hard, so trying to. The last few weeks' pattern has just been that get up, do as much listening as possible, get no senses from it, either because I just don't know the words, or I know all the words. It's that sort of extreme. So start a new show if I can like it, get enough into it, and then but sometimes I don't manage to stop for the reading at the end of the day, because if I'm into it I don't want to stop, because I'll lose my momentum. But then if I finish a show, I have to find another show, and that's another bit of stress just immediately. Half or more of the day watching before reading, and 15 sentences is the kind of recommended thing. I can't even make that sometimes. Sometimes I get just about that from reading the thing at the end of the day, if I'm lucky. Yesterday, I got 3 sentences. And today, I'm using my reading time now to make this video for you. I'm getting no extra sentences today. You can get to what Kat's got in 18 months with 15 sentences a day. That's fine, if you don't count RTK. And also, I'm going to pass what Kat's got pretty soon. I'm hoping to get past 7,000 by the end of this month, but that may not be guaranteed at all, and that really crushes me. Because if I got 50 sentences a day, I would make that. I mean, I've already got 70 or 80 something sentences to make that goal, but I might just not make it. And that means that further on more, I just don't know when I'm going to get to fluency, because I don't know how much losing listening time has just lost that. Because of course you're going to get speaking from listening, but of course you can get fluency but bad accent, so I don't know actually how much, how close I am to fluency at any point. So it's kind of like trying to make up for stuff that I might not be able to make up for, while also not knowing what the level is to go forward. Oh yeah, as I mentioned, those periods where when I went from when I finished something through another thing, and I looked at previews of things. Yeah, I used to do that with light novels too. But the trouble is now that if I read a preview of something, a whole preview of a light novel, that is all my reading time for the day. I can't fit multiple previews in the day to figure out what I'm going to read in the future. If I read a preview of a light novel, that is all the reading I will make in the day. So it might be something that I find out that I don't even like, and that'll be the reading. So I'm not exactly sure where to go in the future. I'm trying to better balance audio and reading generally. I don't know how to feel about the main thing I'm going towards. But particularly Progress, I could probably still make the goal in the 18 months. Probably. If I consistently get 15 sentences a day, which I probably won't. But after that I'll just run after, and then I'm going to run into money problems. People have part-time jobs, naturally it makes sense. I wanted to do as much as possible for a part-time job, because I'm just going to mash into it. Because not only when you get a fraction of the time, it's not just a fraction of the time, it's actually smaller than that fraction, because, as Matt has mentioned, it's exponential. The more consistent time you can spend with it, the better. If you did half the time and double the amount of years, you're not going to be as good as the guy who did it in half that time with double the time. Which not. Even though it's technically the same amount of time.
So my future things would be trying to figure out how my audiobook's going to work, trying to get more into it. Light Novel 1 is okay for understanding. I'm getting more used to it just by going through it, so it's not too bad. I hate that it has random annoying sound effects made by the person reading it, and I hate that the whole genre of book is going to be like so limited. So I just don't know how to get on without becoming like the best person ever at anything you can listen and then go into audiobooks. Cause it's just a bunch of descriptions that we'll never hear in normal everyday thingamajig. But it can also help open the path to other words that aren't just random descriptions. But still, you can use them for things. Just even descriptive words will eventually be used in other things, you know. And then I'm gonna maybe sometime soon start working on pitch accent. You know, which doesn't come naturally just from adult learners getting in a lot of listening, most likely because their native language hasn't required it for that long, so they just don't need that part of their brain. I put in the work for the cards. Every time I have a card that doesn't have pitch accent, I put it in. But then again, Matt recommends just looking up cards. Well, not looking up cards. Look up words you already know when you hear them and testing the pitch accent to see if you got it right. You probably don't need anything more than that for most of the words that you know. So maybe mostly best for new cards. Maybe don't really matter for old cards, especially since I might have to start retesting them for checking that, and that'll be a weird way of like resetting my progress on those cards, but I don't know how much that matters in the long run. A lot of the problem with this is there's even a lack of sources in Japan, like from Japan itself and sort of thing, which you kind of get because they don't need to understand it, but then again they do make quite specific things, but some things just aren't explained well enough. Like recently Matt made a video just about pitch accent dictionaries for the hell of it, and it was still quite interesting. Like, things might get better in the future if people start AJATT later, because I don't know, it's not like super high confidence, it's the best guy ever, but it's Matt vs Japan is probably the best AJATT guy that most is willing to talk to most people. And his work on it might just help crack it for everyone else, for all we know. Otherwise, most likely paying attention to Dogen. Because he's really the only person that does that sort of thing. So I'll probably get on his Patreon, watch his videos about how to do the pitch accent, and start paying notice of that, and see how well that goes. I'm sorry to end on such a sad note, but, you know, I wanted to cover all the things, and want to make sure that you don't screw up in ways that I screw up. And sorry for not looking at the camera so much. But I would like to thank you for making it through all this video, if you did. Even just the bits you liked, as long as you saw this bit, thank you. I might upload it as separate videos or just put it together. Who knows? It's so long at this point. I don't know who's going to watch it. Maybe my closest friends, because after all, I'm not someone that's finished AJATT, so having this long isn't great. This is almost as long as Matt's actual like AJATT the entire journey video. But good luck to any people endeavouring to learn language for whatever reason. And I mean, I hope that I was helpful in any way, at least if it's just spreading how useful AJATT really is to just learning languages in general. But if you want to go through mass immersion approach, I call it that. No problem with that. That's basically better, so don't worry about it. It's also called MIA, which is totally what you'll be doing when you do any of those processes, as far as people want to know. When I built this desk, I took a picture of it and put it on Twitter and referred to it as now I'm activating my stand called Dead to the World. And it's truly worked marvellously this entire year. But, so, fellow language learning people, hello and goodbye, and I hope I didn't make you angry. But maybe a little bit.